When you think of German history, many people immediately think of the German Empire, the World Wars, or the division of Germany. But one chapter is often forgotten or only mentioned in passing: the German colonies. It is about power, exploitation, violence, and consequences that continue to have an impact today. But how could Germany have colonies at all, and why is it being talked about so intensively again today? Before we start, write me in the comments. In your opinion, should the topic of German colonial history be dealt with much more in schools, yes or no? I'm very curious about your opinion. And if you are interested in such historical topics that are often overlooked, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss any more videos. Now we are entering the history of the German colonies. Chapter 1. Introduction. The repressed chapter of German history. When people in Germany talk about their own history, the focus is usually on other eras. Many people first think of the founding of the Reich, the First World War, the Weimar Republic, National Socialism, the division of Germany, and reunification. These events have left a deep mark on the country, and it is therefore understandable that they have a firm place in the historical consciousness. But between all these well-known chapters lies an area that has long received surprisingly little attention: German colonial history. Although the German Reich had colonies for only a few decades, the consequences of this rule were serious, for the people in the occupied territories as well as for Germany's self-image. So it is by no means a marginal topic, but a central chapter that tells a lot about power, violence, racism, and responsibility. Many people are surprised when they hear that Germany had colonies at all. Compared to Great Britain, France, Spain, or Portugal, the German Reich does not appear at first glance to be a classic colonial power. In fact, Germany entered the colonial race between the European powers relatively late. It was not until the 1880s that the empire began to take control of overseas territories in Africa, the Pacific, and China. These possessions included German Southwest Africa, present-day Namibia, German East Africa with areas of present-day Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi, as well as Cameroon, Togo, and island areas in the Pacific, and the leased territory of Kiautschou in China. In terms of time, German colonial rule was therefore shorter than that of other European powers. But its brevity should not obscure how brutal and consequential it was. This is an important point. The significance of a historical event depends not only on how long it lasted, but also on what happened during that time. In the German colonies, people were deprived of their rights, exploited, expelled, and murdered. Land was taken by force. Economic interests were ruthlessly enforced, and racist ideas were made the basis of political action. This is particularly evident in the genocide of the Herero and Nama in German Southwest Africa, which is now considered one of the most serious German crimes before National Socialism. In other colonies, too, there was brutal oppression, forced labor, military violence, and the destruction of established social structures. Anyone who talks about German history and ignores these aspects is therefore only telling an incomplete part of the truth. There are various reasons why German colonial history has received little attention for so long. One of them lies in the chronological classification. After the end of the First World War, Germany lost its colonies. This seemed to close this chapter for many. Later, the crimes of National Socialism and the Second World War overshadowed almost all other topics. In the shadow of the Holocaust, war, and dictatorship, the colonial past seemed like a sideshow for a long time. In addition, after 1918, Germany no longer exercised direct colonial administration and could therefore more easily indulge in the idea that colonialism was primarily an issue of other countries. Over decades, this created the image that Germany had played only a small or unimportant role in this area. But this image does not stand up to closer scrutiny. The very fact that Germany was part of European imperialism is historically significant. The empire not only wanted to compete economically and militarily with the other great powers, but also symbolically rise to become a world power. At that time, colonies were considered a sign of strength, prestige, and international influence. In politics, business, science, and the public, the idea arose that Germany had to claim its place in the sun, as the later Reich Chancellor Bernhard von Bülow put it. Behind such formulations was a worldview based on superiority, competition, and domination. It was the conviction that European powers had the right to control other regions of the world politically, economically, and culturally. This way of thinking was closely linked to racist ideas. Colonial rule was not simply the occupation of foreign territories, but was also based on the claim that some peoples were more civilized than others and therefore entitled to rule over them. In the 19th century, such ideas were supported by supposedly scientific theories. People were placed in hierarchies, European ways of life were portrayed as superior, and violence against colonized populations was justified as progress or regulatory policy. These racist images were not a marginal phenomenon, but deeply rooted in society. They were found in school textbooks, in newspapers, in exhibitions, in advertising, and in political speeches. Colonialism was therefore not only a project of the military and government, but also a cultural and ideological system that found broad support in Germany. This is precisely why it is important to consider colonial history not only as the history of distant areas. It has always been German domestic politics. The debates about colonies, the economic interests of German companies, the work of missionaries, the activities of colonial associations and media coverage also shaped society in the empire itself. In German cities, so-called people shows were organized, where people from colonized regions were presented like exhibition objects. Museums collected art and cultural assets, often under violent or unequal conditions. Street names honored colonial actors. Children learned early on to look at the world from a European perspective. In this way, colonialism worked not only in Africa, Asia, or the Pacific, but also in the middle of Germany. There are several reasons why the topic is being discussed more intensively again today. On the one hand, historians have conducted more intensive research on the German colonial era in recent decades. It became clearer how systematic the violence in the colonies was and how closely colonialism, racism, and economic interests were connected. On the other hand, descendants of colonized societies, activists, and initiatives from Germany have been increasingly speaking out for years, calling for an honest reappraisal. They ask questions that have long been suppressed. How do we remember colonial crimes? What responsibility does Germany bear today? What happens to looted cultural assets in museums? How should street names and monuments that honor colonial rulers be evaluated? And why is colonial thinking still recognizable in some areas today? These questions show that colonial history is not a closed past. Its effects continue to the present day. In many former colonies, the consequences of violence, border demarcation, and economic exploitation are still being felt. The colonial era has also left its mark on Germany itself, in public spaces, in cultural collections, in family histories, and in social debates about racism and the culture of remembrance. Anyone who wants to understand why certain power relations still exist today, or why some terms, images, and traditions are critically questioned cannot avoid colonial history. This is not about condemning the past retrospectively with today's standards, as is sometimes claimed. Rather, it is a matter of taking historical context seriously and directing the perspective not only to those in power, but also to those affected. For a long time, colonial history was told primarily from the point of view of European actors, as a story of explorers, civil servants, soldiers, and entrepreneurs. Today it is becoming increasingly clear that this view is too narrow. The focus is not only on the decisions in Berlin or the interests of the empire, but above all on the people whose lives were destroyed or radically changed by German rule. Their experiences, their losses, and their resistance belong at the center of any serious representation. Resistance is a crucial concept when talking about German colonies. Colonized populations were not merely passive victims of an overpowering system. In many areas, they resisted land grabbing, forced labor, military subjugation, and cultural paternalism. They fought with weapons, with political organization, with flight, refusal, or clinging to their own traditions. This resistance was often brutally suppressed by the colonial powers, but it shows that colonial rule was never accepted without objection. This is also part of a complete story, not only to describe the power of the colonizers, but also to make visible the courage and ability to act of the colonized. Another important point is the language with which this topic is discussed. Many terms from the colonial era come directly from a racist worldview and should be viewed critically or avoided today. Language is never neutral. It conveys ideas about who is considered civilized, who has power, and whose point of view seems to be self-evident. That is why it is important to classify historical terms and not to adopt them without reflection. Anyone who tells colonial history not only tells facts, but also forms images in their heads. That's exactly why diligence is so important. This script is therefore not only about dates, names, and places, but about a basic understanding. How could it come about that European states presumed to rule over other continents in the first place? Why did the German Reich also want to have colonies? How was this rule organized? What role did business, the military, mission, and science play? What forms of violence were used? And what was the resistance of the people affected? And finally, why is this topic more relevant today than ever? To answer these questions, we need to take a step-by-step approach. First of all, it is important to understand the historical background. Germany did not act in a vacuum, but was part of a European development called imperialism. In the 19th century, numerous European states expanded their power worldwide. They competed for raw materials, markets, trade routes, and political influence. Colonies were an expression of this competition. The German Reich entered this policy late, but with great ambition. Behind this were economic interests, national prestige, and racist ideologies. Only against this background can we understand why Germany claimed territories in Africa, the Pacific, and China, and with what severity this rule was enforced. This first chapter is therefore intended to make one thing clear above all. German colonial history is not a side topic and not an exotic appendix of German history proper. She is part of it. It belongs in any serious examination of this country's past. For it shows how closely striving for power, economic interests, racist worldviews, and state violence can be linked. It also shows that many debates of the present, about memory, responsibility, restitution, and structural racism, have deep historical roots. Perhaps this is exactly the reason why this chapter has been suppressed for so long. It forces us to expand familiar ideas about German history. It reminds us that violence and oppression did not only begin in the 20th century and did not only take place within Europe. It calls on us to listen to those voices that have hardly appeared in classic historical narratives for a long time. And it makes it clear that history does not simply pass, but continues to have an effect in the present. So when we talk about the German colonies, we are not just talking about a distant chapter with old maps and forgotten names. We talk about people, about domination, and about responsibility. We are talking about crimes that must be named, and about memory, which must be more than mere knowledge. Above all, however, we are talking about the question of how a country deals with the dark sides of its past. This is precisely why it is worth taking a look at this suppressed chapter of German history, and this is exactly where our journey through the history of the German colonies begins. Chapter 2: Europe in the Age of Imperialism. To really understand the German colonies, one must first look at the larger context in which they came into being. Germany did not act alone or by chance. German colonial policy was part of an epoch in which almost all of Europe was shaped by a certain way of thinking: imperialism. This refers to the striving of powerful states to extend their political, economic, and military influence far beyond their own borders. In the 19th century, this aspiration became a defining feature of European politics. Especially in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, European powers grabbed more and more territories, resources, and trade routes. This development changed the world profoundly, and it formed the background for the colonial rise of the German Reich. Imperialism did not fall from the sky. It arose from several developments that reinforced each other. Industrialization played a central role. Since the early 19th century, many European countries have changed from agrarian societies to industrial societies. Factories were built, cities grew, Technical innovations accelerated production and transport. Machines made it possible to produce goods on a mass scale. Railways connected regions. Steamships made long-distance trade faster. And new means of communication such as the telegraph ensured that information could be transmitted over long distances in a much shorter time. For the European states, this meant one thing above all. They could produce more than before, but they also needed more raw materials, new sales markets, and secure trade routes. It was precisely here that economic change was combined with foreign policy striving for power. Industrialized countries searched for cotton, copper, rubber, palm oil, cocoa, ores, and many other raw materials. At the same time, they wanted to export the goods they produced to new markets. Colonies seemed extremely attractive from this perspective. They could supply raw materials, serve as sales areas, and be politically secured by military control. From an economic point of view, colonial policy therefore seemed like a logical extension of industrial development for many entrepreneurs, trading companies, and politicians. The fact that the affected areas were already inhabited by humans, culturally shaped and politically organized, was deliberately suppressed or downplayed. But imperialism was not just an economic project. It was also an expression of power and prestige. In the 19th century, the major European powers were in intense competition with each other. Britain had a vast colonial empire, France expanded into Africa and Asia, Russia expanded its influence eastwards, and Belgium, the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, and later Italy also tried to strengthen their position in the world. In this competition, the possession of colonies was increasingly seen as a sign of national greatness. A state that had colonies seemed powerful, modern, and important in world politics. A state without colonies was in danger of being left behind in the eyes of many elites. Colonial policy, therefore, also became a question of international reputation. This idea coincided with a time when nationalism was on the rise in Europe. Nations increasingly saw themselves as communities with a common destiny that had to assert their place in the world. National greatness was measured not only by the strength of the army or the economy, but also by the ability to rule over other areas. Thinking in terms of competition, superiority, and expansion fit perfectly with the imperialist zeitgeist. Many people believed that their nation had a special mission or right to influence other parts of the world. In this way of thinking, colonies became symbols of national pride. They were intended to show that a country could keep up with the leading powers. In addition, there was another important factor: the European feeling of superiority. Imperialism was closely linked to racist and Eurocentric worldviews. Many Europeans were convinced that their culture, their religion, their technology, and their political order were fundamentally superior to other societies. This conviction was not only held in everyday life or in political speeches, but was also supported by seemingly scientific theories. In the 19th century, numerous racist concepts emerged that placed people in alleged hierarchies. Skin color, origin, and culture were used to justify superiority and subordination. In this thinking, European rule did not appear as an injustice, but as a natural order. Particularly influential was the idea that Europe would bring progress, civilization, and order to the colonized territories. This idea was often used as a moral justification for conquest and submission. There was talk of developing uncivilized regions, spreading Christianity, bringing education, or introducing modern administration. In reality, however, it was mostly about control, exploitation, and domination. The so-called civilizing mission was often only an ideological cloak under which economic interests and military force were hidden. The people of Africa, Asia, or the Pacific were not seen as equal partners, but as objects of European politics. Another idea that influenced imperialism was social Darwinism. In the process, ideas from the natural sciences were transferred to human societies, in a distorted and politically abused form. Some thinkers claimed that there was also a constant struggle for survival between peoples and nations, in which the stronger had to prevail. This idea made competition and violence seemingly natural. When a state ruled other countries, or when European powers ruled over non-European societies, This was presented as an expression of natural superiority. Such ideas made a significant contribution to mentally preparing and morally relieving colonial violence. It is important to note that imperialism was not only carried out by governments. Many social groups supported it. Companies hoped for profits, missionaries wanted to spread their faith, researchers and geographers were interested in new spaces, the military was looking for strategic bases, and parts of the press were stirring up colonial enthusiasm. In schools, clubs, and newspapers, an image of the world was conveyed in which Europe was at the center. Foreign countries were exoticized, their inhabitants often devalued or belittled. Maps, exhibitions, and reports on expeditions created the impression that large parts of the world were available to a certain extent and were just waiting to be opened up by Europeans. Imperialism was therefore not only government policy, but a broad cultural phenomenon. This development spurt was particularly visible in Africa. At the beginning of the 19th century, European powers still controlled coastal regions and trading bases, but the interior of the continent was not under direct European rule. This changed dramatically in the second half of the century. Through better weapons, medical advances, and new transport routes, European states were able to penetrate deeper and deeper into the continent. The machine gun gave them military advantages, while the use of quinine improved protection against malaria and facilitated expeditions into the interior. Thus began the so-called race for Africa, in which European powers took control of vast territories in an astonishingly short time. This race was marked by enormous brutality. Borders were drawn on maps, without regard to existing political orders, languages, trade relations, or cultural contexts. Rulers were ousted, treaties were concluded under unequal conditions, uprisings were suppressed, and entire societies were forced into colonial economic structures. What was often presented as discovery or development from a European point of view was usually conquest and foreign rule from the point of view of those affected. Africa was divided, not because there was a political void there, but because European powers disregarded existing societies and put their own claims to power above everything else. Europe's influence also increased considerably in Asia and the Pacific. Britain controlled India, France expanded its power in Indochina, the Netherlands ruled over large parts of present-day Indonesia, and Western states increasingly forced China to make economic and political concessions. Ports were opened, zones of influence were created, trade privileges were enforced, and bases were established. Not everywhere did imperialism take the form of direct colonial rule. Sometimes it was also about economic dependence, military pressure, or political influence. But the basic pattern remained similar. European powers asserted their interests with a claim to superiority. One must not get the impression that the colonized societies were passive. There was resistance everywhere. Rulers tried to defend their power, communities fought against occupiers, people refused to work, fled, organized uprisings, or sought alliances. Colonial rule almost always had to be enforced by force. This shows how little legitimacy it was. Imperialism was not a peaceful process of modernization, but a system that asserted itself through military superiority, intimidation, and structural inequality. For Europe itself, imperialism also had far-reaching consequences. It strengthened nationalist sentiments, intensified rivalry among the great powers, and contributed to a general militarization of politics. Colonial conflicts could quickly trigger international tensions. If several powers lay claim to the same regions, crises and diplomatic confrontations threaten. The race for spheres of influence was therefore not only a conflict between Europe and the colonized regions, but also a competition within Europe. In this climate, the idea grew that only strong, expansive states could survive and secure their rank. It was precisely in this context that imperialism gained in importance even for those countries that initially did not have large colonial empires. For them, the question arose as to whether they would be taken seriously in the circle of the great powers if they renounced colonies. This question became particularly important for the German Reich. After the founding of the German Empire in 1871, Germany had risen rapidly economically and militarily, but in colonial comparison it initially seemed like a latecomer. While other powers expanded their possessions, Germany was still predominantly concentrated on Europe. This only changed gradually, but the intellectual prerequisites for it were already in place. The desire for international prestige, competition with other powers, the influence of economic interests, and the spread of racist worldviews. So it can be said that imperialism created a kind of stage on which the German Reich soon wanted to position itself as well. The idea that a modern state needs colonies was widespread in the late 19th century. Many feared that those who arrived too late would be disadvantaged in the global power struggle. It was precisely this mood that later contributed to the fact that colonial demands became louder in Germany as well. Entrepreneurs, colonial associations, parts of the press and political groups urged to join in before all the interesting areas were distributed. Europe's imperialism thus became the direct precursor to German colonial policy. But it is important to realize that imperialism has never been just a matter of sheer calculation. It was always also a body of thought, a worldview that morally justified rule and normalized violence. People were not only militarily subjugated, but also linguistically and ideologically devalued. Colonies were therefore not merely economic resource spaces, but scenes of an order in which some wanted to determine others. This order was constantly confirmed by education, science, religion, the media, and politics. Imperialism was so powerful because it was based not only on canons, but also on ideas. When we look at this era today, it is important not to confuse the enthusiasm for colonies at that time with legitimate politics. Just because many European elites thought imperialistically, their rule was not justified. On the contrary, it is precisely the broad acceptance that shows how deeply racism and power thinking were anchored in societies. Imperialism was not an unfortunate side effect of modernity, but a central component of European modernity itself. Technological progress, economic dynamism, and global networking went hand in hand with oppression, exploitation, and violence. This insight is crucial for understanding the German colonies. Germany did not appear on the scene as an exception, but as part of a system that had long been effective throughout Europe. When the empire later acquired colonies, it resorted to ways of thinking, methods, and justifications that had long been established in the imperialist epoch. German colonial history therefore does not begin with concrete possessions in Africa or the Pacific. It begins with a European worldview that celebrated expansion as progress and took domination over others for granted. This makes it clear why the age of imperialism is the real starting point of our history. If you want to understand why Germany wanted colonies in the first place, you first have to understand why colonies seemed so important for European states in the 19th century. It was about raw materials, markets, power, and prestige. It was about competition among great powers. But it was also about ideologies that placed Europe above the rest of the world and justified violence as a means of politics. This mixture gave rise to a system that affected millions of people and still shapes the world today. In the next chapter, we will therefore take a closer look at Germany itself. Then it is about the question of why the German Reich hesitated at first, how the attitude to colonial policy changed, and why the late entry finally became an ambitious colonial project. For only against this background can one understand why Germany sought its place in the imperialist age not only in Europe, but also overseas. Chapter 3: The Late Entry of the German Reich into Colonial Policy. When the German Empire was founded in 1871, the colonial world order had long been in motion. Britain already had a huge empire. France expanded its rule in Africa and Asia. The Netherlands controlled large parts of Indonesia, and other European states also secured spheres of influence around the globe. Against this background, one might expect that the newly founded German Reich would have immediately tried to enter this race. But that is exactly what did not happen at first. Germany did not begin its actual colonial policy until the 1880s, comparatively late. This late entry was no coincidence. It had political, economic, and strategic reasons. At the same time, he shows how the priorities of the empire shifted in a short time. Initial reluctance soon turned into a clear interest in overseas rule. To understand this, One must first look at the situation after the founding of the Reich. The German Reich was a new nation-state that had been put together from many individual states. After the wars of unification and the founding under Prussian leadership, the focus was initially on internal stabilization. The political order had to be consolidated, the administration unified, economic structures expanded, and the new position of power in Europe secured. During these years, Reich Chancellor Otto von Bismarck thought primarily European. His main goal was to secure the new Reich in foreign policy, to forge alliances, and to prevent other great powers from joining forces against Germany. For him, colonies were initially not a central concern, but rather a possible risk. For a long time, Bismarck saw more disadvantages than advantages in overseas possessions. Colonies had to be administered, militarily protected, and economically developed. This cost money, tied up political attention, and could exacerbate international conflicts. This is precisely what Bismarck wanted to avoid. He was convinced that Germany's future would be decided primarily in Europe, not in Africa or the Pacific. That is why he focused on the balance of power on the continent. If Germany plunged into colonial adventures too early or too aggressively, he feared, it could trigger tensions with Great Britain or France and unnecessarily complicate the foreign policy situation. His restraint was therefore not a moral criticism of colonialism, but above all a sober cost-benefit assessment. The economic situation also seemed inconclusive at first. It is true that Germany industrialized at great speed in the 19th century, and its economy grew strongly. But many entrepreneurs were initially not convinced that classic colonies were absolutely necessary for this. International trade often functioned without direct political control over foreign territories. German goods could be exported, raw materials imported, and trade relations established without the empire having to officially own colonies. In this phase, some economic actors believed that it was cheaper and more flexible to rely on informal influence and trade rather than costly colonial administration. Colonies were therefore not automatically considered an economic necessity in the beginning. Nevertheless, in the course of the 1870s and especially 1880s, the pressure on the Reich leadership grew. This pressure came from different directions. An important factor was the general mood in the age of imperialism. The more other powers expanded their colonial empires, the more the idea prevailed in Germany that a modern large state needed colonies. Colonial possessions became a symbol of national strength. In the public, in newspapers, and in certain political circles, the feeling arose that Germany should not be left empty-handed in the division of the world. Those who had no colonies, it was thought, seemed incomplete, less powerful, and internationally disadvantaged. Especially at a time when national pride and competitiveness were on the rise, this argument gained strength. In addition, there were economic interests, which were now more organized. Merchants, trading companies, shipping companies, and entrepreneurs began to campaign more intensively for overseas protected areas. They hoped for privileged access to raw materials, new sales markets, and state support for their business. In some cases, German trading companies were already active on the ground and pushed for their positions to be secured by official protection of the Reich. Especially in Africa and the Pacific, it happened that private actors claimed territories, concluded treaties with local rulers, or wanted to establish zones of influence. These private initiatives played an important role because they presented politics with facts and increasingly drew the state into colonial responsibility. At the same time, colonial-friendly networks and organizations were formed in Germany. Colonial associations promoted the acquisition of overseas territories, published writings, gave lectures, and tried to stir up public sentiment. They presented colonies as a solution to very different problems, as a future market for the economy, as a place for Germans to emigrate, as an expression of national prestige, and as a means of making Germany a world power. The colonized areas were often portrayed as empty, backward, or unused, although they were of course inhabited by people and politically influenced. Such associations helped to create a colonial consciousness that reached far beyond small political circles. Another motive that was often cited was the question of emigration. In the 19th century, Many Germans emigrated to North and South America. Some politicians and publicists saw this as a loss of population and workforce. In their eyes, colonies appeared as possible settlement areas in which German emigrants could live under the German flag. Even though this idea was not always realistic and many colonies were hardly suitable for larger German settlement projects in terms of climate or economy, the idea had a strong symbolic effect. She combined colonial policy with national hopes and the desire to make Germany's presence visible in the world. It was also crucial that Bismarck gradually changed his attitude. Although he remained skeptical in principle, he recognized that colonial issues could become politically useful. Domestically, colonial policy could help to generate national enthusiasm and bind various interest groups to the empire. In foreign policy, it offered the opportunity to use diplomatic tactics and to gain additional room for negotiation in the game of the great powers. Bismarck therefore began to see colonies not only as a burden, but also as an instrument. He did not adopt the romantic enthusiasm of many colonial friends, but he was prepared to allow colonial acquisitions if they could benefit the empire politically and appeared to be as cost-effective as possible. The idea of so-called protected areas played a key role in this. Even the choice of words is revealing. Instead of talking openly about colonies, people often spoke of protected areas at first, as if it were a defensive measure or state protection for German economic interests. The term concealed what was really at stake: the expansion of German rule over non-European territories. This linguistic packaging helped to reduce resistance and make colonial expansion appear as a reasonable, almost technical measure. In fact, protection usually meant above all the protection of German claims, not the protection of the population living there. The concrete entry took place in a phase in which private colonial entrepreneurs were particularly active. Names such as Adolf Luderitz, Karl Peters, or Gustav Nachtigal stand for this development, even if their methods and goals were different. Luderitz, for example, acquired land on the coast of today's Namibia with questionable contracts. Karl Peters concluded treaties with local rulers in East Africa, which, from the German point of view, served as the basis for claims to power. Such contracts were often highly unequal, linguistically ambiguous, or concluded under conditions in which the local partners hardly understood the implications as the German actors claimed. Nevertheless, the empire later used these agreements as a pretext to proclaim protected areas and establish political control. In 1884, there was a decisive turning point. The German Reich officially began to place several overseas territories under its protection. These initially included regions in Southwest Africa, Togo, Cameroon, and parts of East Africa. This was the step from a hesitant observer to a colonial power. Bismarck did not act out of sudden colonial conviction, but out of a mixture of pressure, calculation, and opportunity. In the imperialist age, Germany was not to be left without possessions, but at the same time it did not want to provoke other powers unnecessarily and to keep the costs as low as possible. The state therefore initially tried to push private initiatives and partially outsource responsibility. But it soon became apparent that colonial rule could hardly be enforced in the long term without direct state intervention. This was precisely a fundamental contradiction of early German colonial policy. On the one hand, it was hoped to acquire colonies with relatively little effort and use them economically. On the other hand, colonial rule demanded more and more control, administration, infrastructure, and military presence. As soon as local populations resisted, protection troops had to be deployed. Contracts had to be monitored, claims defended, and administrative structures established. The idea that colonies could bring profits almost by themselves and at the same time remain politically troubled proved to be an illusion. Germany entered colonialism late, but quickly adopted its basic logic. Rule had to be organized and, in case of doubt, enforced by force. The belated colonial policy of the empire also had a psychological effect. Precisely because Germany entered later than other powers, a particularly strong need arose in some circles to catch up. Colonial possessions became a sign that the empire was finally one of the world powers. This idea gave additional emphasis to the colonial project. It was not only about concrete raw materials or trade profits, but also about symbolic recognition. Germany did not just want to participate, but to visibly appear as a global power. The desire for a place in the sun, which was later formulated so succinctly, was already clearly noticeable in this phase. Colonies became an expression of a national self-image that reached beyond Europe. It should not be overlooked that not everyone in the German Reich was equally enthusiastic either. There was certainly criticism of colonial plans. Some liberals were skeptical about the financial burdens, others warned of foreign policy risks. Social Democrats criticized colonial policy in part as a project of the ruling classes and as a means of exploitation. Practical doubts were also expressed. Whether colonies were actually economically profitable was by no means always clear. Nevertheless, the pro-colonial forces increasingly asserted themselves. This was also due to the fact that colonial policy was highly emotionally charged. It promised greatness, adventure, prestige, and national unity. Such promises were often more politically effective than sober objections. It is also important to note that Germany's entry into colonial policy was based from the outset on a power imbalance that was racially legitimized. The fact that European actors in Africa or the Pacific concluded treaties, claimed territories, and established rule only seemed self-evident to them because they did not regard the people living there as equal political subjects. Germany's late entry was therefore not a harmless administrative act, but the entry into an already existing system of imperial inequality. The empire adopted not only colonial territories, but also colonial ways of thinking, the idea of European superiority, the right to seize land, and the willingness to break resistance by force. In retrospect, it becomes clear that German colonial policy came together from several strands. First of all, there was European competition, which made colonies a status symbol. In addition, there were economic interests and private initiatives that demanded state protection. There were nationalist hopes for greatness and world standing, domestic political considerations to mobilize the public, and Bismarck's willingness to use colonial policy as a tactical instrument. All these factors reinforce each other. Thus, initial hesitation turned into a colonial project that took concrete shape within a few years. The speed of this development is remarkable. As late as the 1870s, colonies were not the focus of the imperial leadership. Only a few years later, Germany officially belonged to the colonial powers. This change shows how strongly political priorities can change when international competition, social currents, and economic interests come together. But it also shows how little it took to draw an empire into the mechanism of colonial rule. Once the claim to control overseas territories was formulated, the next steps followed almost inevitably: administration, military, land grabbing, economic exploitation, and oppression. This paved the way for the next phase of German colonial policy. Germany was no longer just a spectator in the imperialist age, but an active participant. But with the acquisition of the first protected areas, new conflicts also began. The claims of the empire had to be secured internationally, territories demarcated, and rule organized. It is precisely at this point that Otto von Bismarck once again takes center stage, this time not only as a reluctant chancellor, but as the host of an event that gained enormous significance for the colonial division of Africa, the Berlin-Congo Conference. The next chapter is therefore about what role Bismarck played at this conference, and how the foundations for a new phase of imperial expansion were laid there. Chapter 4: Otto von Bismarck and the Berlin-Congo Conference. When the German Empire began to participate seriously in colonial policy in the 1880s, this development coincided with a phase in which the European powers were expanding their grip on Africa. The continent had become a central arena of imperial competition. Trade interests, raw materials, strategic bases, and national ambition drove states such as Great Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, and now Germany to make ever greater claims to African territories. In this tense situation, Otto von Bismarck, who had long been regarded as a skeptical observer of colonial adventures, appeared in a new role as host and co-creator of the Berlin-Congo Conference from 1884 to 1885. This conference became a key moment in the history of imperialism because it helped to put the colonial division of Africa in order politically and diplomatically, from a European point of view. For the people in Africa, on the other hand, it meant that their countries and habitats were negotiated without them being able to have a say in the decision-making process. To understand the significance of the conference, it is necessary to look at the situation in Africa. In the second half of the 19th century, the advance of European powers into regions that had not previously been under direct colonial control intensified. Trading companies, missionaries, explorers, military and diplomats paved the way for political rule. At the same time, competition among European countries grew. It was not only about real economic interests, but also about prestige and influence. No one wanted to watch as other powers divided up large territories among themselves. The situation came to a head in the Congo Basin in particular. King Leopold II of Belgium had ambitious plans there, presenting his activities as a humanitarian project, when in reality it was about power, control, and economic exploitation. France and Portugal also made claims. The danger of international conflicts increased. This was a delicate situation for Bismarck. He still thought primarily in European terms and wanted to limit conflicts between the great powers as much as possible. At the same time, the German Reich could not be completely left out when the colonial reorganization of Africa was discussed. In the meantime, Germany had developed its own interests, and with the first protected areas in Africa, the empire itself had become part of the imperial competition. Bismarck recognized that an international conference offered several advantages. It could help to defuse disputes between the powers, to make Germany's new role visible, and to embed its own colonial claims in a diplomatic framework. He invited the representatives of the participating states to Berlin. The Berlin-Congo Conference began in November 1884 and lasted until February 1885 and was attended by delegates from numerous European countries as well as the United States and the Ottoman Empire. What is striking and historically significant is who was not represented. No African rulers, no representatives of African societies, no political voices from the areas that were discussed. This showed the fundamental power relationship of imperialism from the very beginning. Europe treated Africa as an object of international politics, not as a space of sovereign actors with their own rights, interests, and political orders. This is precisely one of the central significances of the conference. It made Europe's colonial claim visible at the diplomatic level and legitimized it. It is often said that the Berlin-Congo Conference has divided Africa. This is abbreviated in this form, but not completely wrong. The conference itself did not yet draw all the boundaries definitively on the map, as it is sometimes portrayed in a simplified way. Many borders and concrete territorial agreements were only drawn in the years that followed in bilateral treaties, expeditions, and colonial administrative acts. But the conference created the framework in which this division could take place in the future. It laid down rules according to which territorial claims were to be recognized, and it strengthened the idea that European powers were entitled to subordinate African territories among themselves. It was therefore not a final act of partition, but a decisive political starting point for the accelerated colonial conquest of large parts of Africa. An important point of the negotiations was the future of the Congo region. Leopold II had built up influence there through international organizations and seemingly scientific humanitarian initiatives. In fact, he pursued personal interests in power. At the conference, the so-called Congo Free State was recognized, which in reality was by no means free, but de facto under the Belgian king. Even the name obscured reality. Under Leopold's rule, the Congo later developed into one of the cruelest systems of exploitation of the colonial era, characterized by forced labor, violence, and mass death. Even if these extreme consequences were not yet visible in their later form at the conference, the recognition of the Congo Free State shows how much European powers were willing to concede colonial rule to each other as long as their own interests were safeguarded. Another key decision concerned freedom of trade in the Congo Basin and along the Niger. At first glance, this seemed like a liberal open principle. No power should monopolize trade in certain regions. But here, too, you have to take a closer look. This regulation did not serve to protect African societies, but the interests of European states and companies. The aim was to secure economic access and avoid conflicts among themselves. In this logic, Africa appeared above all as an economic area whose resources and markets were to be open to the imperial powers. The idea that the people living there could determine this economic order themselves did not play a role. The principle of so-called effective occupation was particularly consequential. The idea behind this was that a colonial claim could no longer be secured by symbolic acts or general declarations alone. Anyone who claimed a territory for themselves was supposed to exercise a certain form of control there, for example through administration, contracts, military presence, or economic organization. This principle had enormous consequences. It increased the pressure on the European powers not only to record their claims on maps or in diplomatic notes, but to enforce them practically on the ground. The conference thus accelerated the race for Africa. For now, powers that wanted to secure their claim had to act quickly, occupy territories, create administrative structures, and break local resistance. For the people in Africa, this development meant a dramatic worsening of the situation. Where European claims might have been loose or uncertain before, an incentive for direct rule now emerged. Regions were explored more intensively, treaties were demanded more aggressively, military units were deployed, and political structures were systematically undermined. So the conference was not just a diplomatic event in Berlin, but a catalyst for real violence in Africa. It contributed to the fact that within a few years huge areas of the continent came under formal colonial control. This did not happen peacefully and not in agreement with the societies concerned, but through pressure, deception, military superiority, and often open brutality. What role did Bismarck play in this exactly? He was not the ideological champion of a borderless German colonial empire, as later colonial enthusiasts might have wished. But he was the skillful power politician who recognized that Germany could benefit from a moderating and at the same time co-shaping position. As host of the conference, he strengthened the international reputation of the German Reich. Berlin appeared as a place where world politics was made. At the same time, the conference helped Germany to diplomatically secure its own colonial steps. The empire no longer appeared as a belated newcomer, but as a state that was involved in the formulation of imperial rules. Bismarck's role was thus ambiguous. On the one hand, he tried to limit conflicts among the great powers and to enable orderly competition. On the other hand, he contributed to the stabilization and legitimacy of the colonial system precisely in this way. He did not question the basic assumption that European powers were allowed to control African territories. On the contrary, the conference presupposed this assumption. Bismarck therefore did not organize a neutral peace conference on Africa, but a conference of imperial powers on the rules of their expansion. The fact that he sought diplomatic stability does not change the fact that the result was a further step towards colonial subjugation. The language in which the conference took place is also remarkable. As is so often the case in a colonial context, domination and exploitation were shrouded in terms that sounded harmless or even positive. There was talk of trade, civilization, protection, freedom, and order. Such terms obscure what was really at stake: access to land, people, and resources. Precisely because colonial policy liked to pass itself off as progress, it is important to look behind this language. The Berlin-Congo Conference was not a project of international justice, but a diplomatically codified act of power. It formulated rules for competition among the colonial powers, not for the freedom of colonized societies. The conference was also of great importance for later German colonial policy. It coincided with the very years in which Germany established its first protected areas in Africa. The rules developed there helped to politically embed German claims in Southwest Africa, Togo, Cameroon, and East Africa. At the same time, the conference created a climate in which colonial expansion appeared normal, legitimate, and internationally regulable. Germany was now able to position itself as a colonial power with greater self-confidence. What had previously begun as a hesitant experiment was given a new political firmness by the international stage of the conference. However, one should not make the mistake of seeing the Berlin-Congo Conference as a mere game of great powers that took place only in diplomatic acts and government circles. Its consequences reached deep into the lives of countless people. For each zone of influence formulated on maps or in agreements later meant concrete rule on the ground. It meant new taxes, forced labor, loss of land, missionary work, military punitive expeditions, and the restructuring of local orders. When European states drew borders or claimed territories, they ignored existing trade routes, cultural contexts, territories, and social relations. This created artificial border areas and political units, the consequences of which continue to have an impact in many places to this day. Especially in Africa, the disregard for local realities was particularly clear. From a European perspective, the continent often appeared as an empty space that could be ordered and divided. In fact, complex societies, empires, city-states, trade networks, and political alliances existed there. The idea that Europe had given Africa structure or history was wrong even then and only served to justify colonial rule. The Berlin-Congo Conference put exactly this perspective into practice by ignoring African independence and instead focusing on European claims. In addition, the conference also had a symbolic effect. It signaled to the European public that colonial policy was no longer just a matter for individual adventurers or trading companies, but was part of official, internationally recognized state policy. This gave colonialism a semblance of legality and normality. What happened under military or economic pressure now appeared to be the result of diplomatic understanding. This symbolism was important because it helped to dampen resistance and make colonial expansion appear as a rational component of modern politics. Germany, in particular, which had only recently entered into colonial policy itself, benefited from this. Despite all the diplomatic packaging, the reality of the colonial project remained violent. No conference resolution could change this. In practice, the rule of effective occupation almost always meant that local societies had to be disempowered. Freedom of trade did not mean free choice for African producers, but opening up to European interests. Recognition of claims did not mean legal certainty for the population, but security for colonial rule. The closer one looks at the actual consequences, the clearer it becomes that the Berlin-Congo Conference, although formulated by diplomats, paved the way for very real repression. Bismarck himself did not remain a passionate colonial ideologue even after the conference. He continued to view colonies primarily from the point of view of political utility. But with the conference, he had created a framework in which Germany could not only hold colonial possessions, but also present them as part of an international system. This was significant for the self-image of the Reich. Germany thus moved further into the circle of those powers that acted in world politics and determined non-European areas. The Berlin-Congo Conference was therefore not only an event in African or international history, but also a step in the self-staging of the German Reich as a global power. In retrospect, the conference is one of the clearest examples of how colonialism was legitimized by bureaucracy, diplomacy, and political language. Violence did not begin where soldiers shot or villages burned down. She also began to decide on other people without her participation in meeting rooms, on cards, in contracts, and in the arrogance of making decisions. This is precisely what makes the Berlin-Congo Conference so historically significant. It shows that colonial rule was based not only on military strength, but also on international recognition, legal constructions, and a common imperial thinking of the European powers. For Germany, this moment was groundbreaking. After the conference, it was clear that the Reich no longer treated its late entry into colonial policy as a temporary episode. The new role now had to be practically filled. Diplomatic recognition became concrete rule. Letters of protection became administrative structures. Claims turned into violent relationships. The next chapter therefore focuses on one of the most important German colonies, German Southwest Africa. There it became particularly clear how imperial ambitions could become a system of land grabbing, oppression, and finally systematic annihilation. Chapter 5: German Southwest Africa, the First Great Colony. German Southwest Africa was the first large colony of the German Reich in Africa and developed into a central place of German colonial policy early on. The area of today's Namibia occupied a special position in the colonial thinking of the empire. It was considered prestigious, strategically useful, and in parts even a possible settlement area for Germans. But behind these ideas there was a system of appropriation, repression, and violence from the beginning. In hardly any other German colony was it so clear how a destructive model of rule emerged from economic interests, racist thinking, and state power. Anyone who looks at the history of German Southwest Africa looks not only at the emergence of a colony, but also at the early form of a colonial regime of violence, which found its cruelest expression in the genocide of the Herero and Nama. Before the German Reich ruled there, the area was by no means empty or politically unorganized, even if it was later often portrayed as such in colonial representations. In southwestern Africa, different population groups lived with their own social orders, economic networks, and political structures. These included the Herero, the Nama, the Damara, and the San. The Herero were known above all for their livestock farming and organized themselves in complex social contexts. The Nama also lived in independent political communities and had local leadership structures. There were trades, conflicts, alliances, and migratory movements between different groups. European traders, missionaries, and other travelers were active in the region even before formal German colonial rule, but these contacts did not initially mean complete political control by a European power. The official entry of the German Empire into Southwest Africa began with the activities of the Bremen merchant Adolf Luderitz. In the early 1880s, Luderitz was looking for ways to acquire land on the African coast. In 1883, he concluded treaties with local authorities, which later served as the basis for ownership claims from a German point of view. Deception also played a role in this. Particularly well known is the so-called mileage fraud, in which different ideas about which unit of measurement was meant. Such practices already show how unequal the conditions were under which colonial land grabbing took place. The treaties were later protected by the German Empire, and in 1884 Bismarck placed Luderitz acquisitions under the protection of the Reich. This marked the beginning of formal German rule in German Southwest Africa. Even the designation protected area concealed what it was actually about. Above all, German interests were protected: land claims, trade opportunities, and strategic positions. For the local population, the proclamation of the protected area did not mean protection, but the beginning of a development that massively threatened their livelihoods. Because with German rule, the relationship with the country changed fundamentally. For many local societies, land was not simply private property in the European sense, but part of communal use, social order, and economic existence. The colonial power, on the other hand, increasingly regarded land as a measurable, saleable, and appropriatable good. These different views not only led to misunderstandings, but were also actively used by the German side to enforce ownership claims. In the first few years, German control remained incomplete. The colonial power was limited in terms of personnel and military, and it was dependent on intermediaries, traders, and missionaries. But she gradually expanded her presence. Administrative posts were established, military units were set up, and political relations with local leaders were sought or enforced. In doing so, the empire pursued two goals at the same time. It wanted to consolidate its rule and at the same time enable economic use. Particularly important for this was the extraction of land for settlers, cattle breeding, and later also for mining and other economic activities. This objective made the colony a space of intensive expropriation from the very beginning. This was precisely a central difference to some other colonial models. German Southwest Africa was not only seen as a trading area, but also as an area in which German settlers were to settle permanently. This made the competition for land particularly fierce. White settlers, colonial officials, and entrepreneurs wanted access to fertile land, grazing grounds, and water points. For the Herero and Nama, whose economic existence depended heavily on livestock farming and access to land, this development was existentially threatening. When land was taken, roads blocked or water points controlled. This affected not only property relations, but the survival of entire communities. German colonial rule was based not only on direct military force, but also on economic dependence, legal constructions, and political pressure. Debt relations played an important role. Merchants granted loans, delivered goods or weapons, and used payment problems to claim livestock or land. Because European legal concepts were increasingly made the basis of colonial decisions, many natives found themselves in a situation in which they were systematically disadvantaged. Treaties were interpreted from a German perspective, while local norms and understandings were hardly recognized. In this way, a colonial model of order emerged step by step, which legally secured European claims and restricted Africa's room for maneuver. At the same time, German rule was characterized by deep-rooted racist thinking. The people of Southwest Africa were not regarded by many German officials, officers, and settlers as equal political partners, but as belonging to a lower cultural level. This attitude shaped the entire way in which the local population was treated. It justified paternalism, deprivation of rights, and, in case of doubt, brutal violence. Racism was not a side effect in the colony, but a cornerstone of rule. It determined who was allowed to own land, whose testimony counted in court, who was considered capable or willing to work, and against whom military means were considered legitimate. In the 1890s, tensions intensified. The German presence became stronger, the pressure on land and resources increased, and at the same time many communities suffered from economic and ecological crises. Livestock epidemics, droughts, and the consequences of colonial interventions further destabilized the region. In particular, Repressed, which destroyed large parts of the livestock in the late 1890s, hit the Herero hard. Because livestock was central to their economy and social order, this loss meant a profound crisis. The Germans often took advantage of this plight by expanding land purchases, forcing wage labor, and strengthening their control over economically weakened communities. Colonial expansion was thus combined with the exploitation of a humanitarian catastrophe. The further German rule was expanded, the more clearly its actual character became apparent. It was not about equal coexistence, but about dominance. Local leaders were either integrated, controlled, or disempowered. Resistance was treated as a disturbance of a supposedly legitimate order. The Schutztrupp, i.e., the military power of the colony, became an increasingly important instrument. Officers and colonial officials often saw themselves as representatives of a superior civilization that had to enforce discipline and order. This spirit also shaped everyday colonial practice. Corporal punishment, humiliation, coercive measures, and arbitrary violence were part of reality in many places. For the German public, German Southwest Africa also became a symbol of imperial ambition. The colony occupied a special place in newspapers, colonial associations, and political debates. It appeared as proof that Germany could also control overseas territories and act as a world power. In colonial-friendly representations, the area was often staged as a space for German development, as a landscape that had to be developed, ordered, and made economically viable. Such narratives largely ignored the reality of the native population or portrayed it as an obstacle on the way to colonial development. This was precisely where the ideological function of the colony became apparent. It served not only exploitation, but also the self-staging of the empire. With the spread of German rule, a society emerged that was increasingly organized along racist lines. White settlers and officials claimed political power, legal privileges, and economic advantages. African population groups, on the other hand, were increasingly deprived of their rights. They lost land, were forced into wage labor, and were subject to an order in which they were subordinate to colonial interests. A colonial hierarchy emerged that was not built up by chance, but systematically. Especially in a settler colony like German Southwest Africa, this hierarchy was particularly sharp, because the permanent settlement of Germans structurally presupposed the displacement of the previous population. The situation finally escalated at the beginning of the 20th century. For many Herero, it had become clear that German rule threatened their political independence, their economic existence and their future. Land losses, debts, mistreatment, and the general deprivation of rights had reached a level that could no longer be tolerated. In 1904, parts of the Herero rose up against the German colonial power under the leadership of Samuel Herero. The uprising was directed against the progressive expropriation and subjugation. For the German side, this was a shock, but at the same time an occasion to react with extreme severity. The reaction to the uprising already showed how little willingness there was for political understanding. Instead of looking for solutions, the Reich relied on massive military force. With the dispatch of General Lothar von Trotha, brutalization reached a new level. Von Trotha represented a particularly radical form of colonial thinking. He did not regard negotiations with the Herero as a serious option, but relied on extermination as a means of securing power. After the Battle of Waterberg in August 1904, large parts of the Herero were pushed into the Omahik Desert. There, von Trotha had the entrances to water points monitored or blocked and issued his notorious extermination order. Men, women, and children were to be left to die. This policy was not an accidental consequence of military conflicts, but targeted annihilation. Thousands of people died of thirst, hunger, and exhaustion in the desert. A little later, the violence also hit the Nama, who also rose up against German rule. They were also persecuted with extreme severity. What happened in German Southwest Africa was more than a brutal suppression of colonial resistance. It was the first genocide of the 20th century. The German troops not only killed in battle, but deliberately pursued the destruction of entire population groups. Anyone who talks about the colony cannot therefore stop at questions of administration, economy, or settlement policy. At the center of their story is the connection between land grabbing, racism, and systematic extermination. Even where people escaped the immediate killings, the suffering continued. Survivors were locked up in camps, used for forced labor, and held in catastrophic conditions. Disease, malnutrition, and abuse claimed further victims. The colonial order was not mitigated after the genocide, but reorganized, now on the basis of even stricter controls. African people were forced into work regimes, their freedom of movement was restricted, and their social structures were further destroyed. The land of the victims was increasingly given to German settlers. In this respect, the genocide was not only an act of military force, but also part of a comprehensive colonial project of reshaping the country in favor of German interests. If you look at German Southwest Africa, you can see very clearly why this colony plays such a central role in the history of the German Reich. It was the first large colony, an experimental field of German settlement and rule policy, and finally the scene of a crime against humanity. The area was not only occupied militarily, but profoundly transformed. Societies were smashed, livelihoods destroyed, and people disenfranchised, expelled, and murdered. The aftermath continues to the present day, both in Namibia and in Germany, where there has long been a struggle for recognition, responsibility, and remembrance. This is precisely why German Southwest Africa is more than just a chapter of colonial expansion. It is a key to understanding German colonial rule as a whole. Here we can see particularly clearly how colonialism worked, first through treaties and protective claims, then through land grabbing, economic control, racist order, and finally through open extermination. Anyone who understands this history also understands that the German colonial empire was never a harmless or minor project. From the beginning, it was a system of oppression that found its darkest expression in Southwest Africa. In the next chapter, the focus is on another central colony of the empire, German East Africa. There, a different form of colonial rule emerged, with different geographical conditions, other economic interests, and other forms of resistance. But there too control, exploitation, and violence were the focus. Chapter 6: German East Africa: Domination, Control, and Exploitation. German East Africa was the largest and one of the most important colonies of the German Empire. The area included large parts of today's Tanzania as well as Rwanda and Burundi, making it significantly larger than the former German Empire in Europe. Because of its size and economic possibilities alone, this colony occupied an important position in the colonial thinking of the empire. But as in all German colonies, there was a huge gap between the official self-portrayal and the actual reality. What was often described in Germany as construction, order and progress meant control, coercion, violence and far-reaching interventions in their lives for many local people. German East Africa was not a distant administrative project, but a sphere of domination in which colonial power was combined with economic exploitation and military oppression. Before the Germans gained a foothold in East Africa, the region was characterized by great diversity. There were numerous societies with their own political structures, economic systems, and cultural traditions. Coastal cities with a long trading history connected the East African mainland with the Indian Ocean, with Arabia, Persia, and India. Internally, there were different forms of rule, smaller political communities, regional centers of power, and widely ramified social relations. The region was therefore by no means unorganized or isolated, but part of existing trade and communication areas. The influence of the Sultanate of Zanzibar was particularly strong on the coast, playing a central role in trade in the 19th century and exerting influence over various coastal areas. Germany's entry into this region was closely linked to private colonial initiatives. Karl Peters, one of the most controversial figures in German colonial history, was particularly important. In the 1880s, Peters acted on behalf of colonial interests and concluded treaties with local rulers that, from the German point of view, served as the basis for territorial claims. As in other colonial territories, these treaties were highly problematic. They were based on unequal power relations, on linguistic and legal differences, and on a colonial perspective that fundamentally valued German interpretations more highly than the ideas of the African contracting parties. Nevertheless, the German Reich used these agreements to formulate claims for protection and to expand its presence in East Africa. Even at this early stage, it became clear that colonial rule in East Africa was not accepted without resistance. In 1888, there was a major uprising on the coast against German influence. One of the reasons for this was that German representatives tried to take over the coastal administration and thus displace existing political and economic structures. The resistance was directed against this interference and made it clear that the population was by no means prepared to simply accept German rule. The so-called Arab uprising, as it was often called in older German accounts, was in reality broader and more complex than this term suggests. It was an expression of regional resistance to colonial control and was crushed by military force on the German side. This alone set the direction. Rule in German East Africa would not be based on consent, but on coercion. After the suppression of this early resistance, the German Reich began to build up its colonial order more systematically. Administration, military, and economic planning were more closely linked. The German East African Society, which had initially played an important role, soon proved to be too weak to exercise lasting control. The state therefore intervened more directly and took on more responsibility. This transformed the colony from a semi-private project into a more state-organized area of rule. At the top were governors and civil servants who claimed to enforce order, efficiency, and economic development. But this order was based on inequality and violence. A central instrument of German rule was the Schutztrupp. Contrary to what the name suggests, it did not serve to protect the native population, but to secure colonial interests. It was the military backbone of the colony and was used to put down uprisings, enforce territorial claims, and force the population to subordinate. The Schutztrupp consisted of German officers and African soldiers, the so-called askari. This structure was typical of many colonial armies. European powers used local or regionally recruited soldiers to rule. This was another reason why colonial violence was embedded in the everyday life of the colony. Behind every administrative order was ultimately the possibility of military enforcement. The German colonial rulers wanted not only political control in East Africa, but above all economic benefit. The colony was to supply raw materials and produce them for export. To do this, the economy had to be restructured according to colonial interests. Plantation farming was expanded, transport routes were laid out, and in certain regions production centers for goods such as cotton, sisal, rubber or other agricultural products emerged. This development was often described in German reports as modernization. In fact, it often meant that local societies were forced into new dependencies. Traditional forms of economy were weakened, subsistence farming was put under pressure and labor power was steered into colonially desired channels. The question of work was particularly important. Colonial exploitation only worked if enough people were available for construction projects, plantations, transport, and other activities. But many Africans had little reason to volunteer for German companies or the colonial state, especially since the working conditions were harsh, the pay was low, and the treatment was often humiliating. Therefore, the colonial power resorted to various coercive measures. Taxes were introduced, which had to be paid in money, so that people were forced to accept wage labor. Work obligations, pressure from local rulers, and direct violence complemented this system. This gave rise to a colonial labor order in which economic development was not based on free decision, but on structural coercion. This exploitation was legitimized by a racist thinking of domination. German officials, settlers, and entrepreneurs often regarded the population as in need of discipline, lazy, or backward. Such attributions served to justify forced labor, corporal punishment, and authoritarian control. The colonial administration often spoke of education for work or civilization, when in reality it meant subordination. Here, too, racism was not a secondary aspect, but a central principle of order. He determined who ruled over whom, who had rights, and whose interests were considered important. The population of German East Africa was not recognized as a political community with its own claims, but was regarded as a reserve of manpower and a mass of subjects. A particularly clear symbol of German rule was the expansion of infrastructure. Railways, roads, administrative stations, and ports were built to better control the land and make economic use of it. In colonial narratives, these projects were seen as proof of German performance. But here, too, it is worth taking a closer look. Infrastructure was not created primarily for the benefit of the local population, but to transport raw materials more quickly, facilitate military movements, and bind remote regions more closely to the colonial power. The construction of these facilities consumed large amounts of labor and was often carried out under duress or in extremely harsh conditions. What was celebrated as progress was therefore at the same time an instrument of control. Colonial rule also intervened deeply in the social and political life of the people. In many regions, local authorities were reshaped, pressured, or integrated into the colonial system. The empire relied partly on existing power structures insofar as they were useful for the administration, and weakened them where they made independent resistance possible. This changed political relations on the ground. Some leaders were given new functions as mediators of the colonial power, others lost influence or were fought. The colonial order thus not only created new hierarchies between Germans and Africans, but also changed the balance of power within African societies themselves. Missionaries also played an important role in this context. They built schools, churches, and mission stations and participated in cultural transformation. From their point of view, it was about the spread of Christianity and moral education. In fact, mission and colonial rule were often closely related. Missionaries were not identical with soldiers or civil servants, but they often contributed to spreading colonial ideas of order, work, and way of life. Schools taught not only reading and writing, but also obedience, European norms, and the devaluation of local traditions. In this way, colonial rule was anchored not only militarily and economically, but also culturally. The violence of German rule manifested itself in many forms. There were open military punitive expeditions against resistance, but also everyday violence in the administrative actions, in labor discipline, and in the social relations of the colony. Beatings, humiliations, and arbitrary measures were no exception. For many people, colonial rule consisted not only of distant laws or abstract structures, but of very concrete experiences of coercion, fear, and powerlessness. The fact that German sources have long spoken primarily of order, performance, and construction shows less the reality on the ground than the willingness to trivialize violence or to present it as necessary. The climax of the resistance against German rule in East Africa was the Maji Maji Uprising from 1905 to 1907. Even though this topic will be the focus of the next chapter, it already belongs here in the context of domination and exploitation. The uprising was not a sudden, incomprehensible explosion, but the result of years of stress. In particular, the cultivation of cotton, which the Germans forced in many regions, created considerable pressure. People had to spend labor on colonial production goals, while their own supply suffered. In addition, there were taxes, mistreatment, and the general experience of foreign rule. In this situation, a broad resistance arose, which affected various population groups and was directed against the German colonial order. The German reaction to this uprising was brutal. Villages were destroyed, fields destroyed, and entire regions devastated. The colonial power deliberately relied on a strategy that was intended to break the resistance through hunger. Thousands of people died not only from direct violence, but also from the destruction of their livelihoods. This is precisely where it becomes particularly clear how rule in German East Africa worked. It was not based on consent, but on the willingness to use comprehensive violence against the population when colonial interests were endangered. Economic exploitation and military oppression were two sides of the same order. Despite this violence, the German Reich repeatedly tried to make its rule appear rational and modern. Governors such as Julius von Soden or later Bernhard von Reichenberg stood for different focal points in the administration, but the basic character of the colony remained the same. Even where reforms were discussed or excessive hardship was criticized, no one fundamentally questioned German rule as such. The colony was supposed to become more efficient, orderly, or economically successful, not fairer or self-determined. It is precisely this attitude that shows that colonial reforms often only change the form of rule, but not its core. For the German Reich, German East Africa was of great symbolic and political importance. The colony was huge, strategically important, and a visible part of the colonial self-image in the German public. Reports on landscapes, railways, plantations, and administrative projects were intended to show that Germany was also efficient and orderly overseas. But behind this image was a reality that was characterized by expropriation, forced labor, and violence. The colony was not proof of German civilization, but proof of how closely economic interests, racist ideology, and military power could be linked. German East Africa also shows that colonialism consisted not only of spectacular wars or individual massacres, but also of a permanent system of control. Everyday life and rule were closely intertwined. Those who demanded taxes, procured labor, had roads built, or organized schools never acted outside the colonial power structure. Even seemingly neutral measures usually served to make the colony more usable and the population more controllable. This was precisely where the stability of the system lay. It was not only brutal, but also deeply intervening in people's lives in terms of organization. If you look at German East Africa, it becomes clear that this colony was a core part of the German colonial empire. It combined economic ambitions with territorial control, military power with administrative penetration, and racist rule with the transformation of entire regions. Unlike in German Southwest Africa, the focus here was not on the settler colony, but on a large-scale area of dominion that was to be ordered for production, transport, and political control. But the result was similar. The local population lost autonomy, was exploited and subjugated by force. This is precisely why German East Africa is a key example of the functioning of German colonial rule as a whole. This shows how commercial interests became state rule, how administration and the military interacted, and how economic exploitation was hardly conceivable without coercion. Above all, however, it shows that resistance was not an exceptional case, but a logical reaction to oppression. In the next chapter, therefore, the focus shifts to the German colonies in West Africa, i.e. Cameroon and Togo. There, different framework conditions were at work, but there too colonial claims were combined with control, economic use, and structural violence. Chapter 7. Cameroon and Togo, German rule in West Africa. When talking about the German colonies, the focus is often on German Southwest Africa and German East Africa. This is understandable, because particularly drastic forms of colonial violence were evident there, and because these areas were of great importance in terms of area and politics. But the West African colonies of Cameroon and Togo were also central components of the German colonial empire. They were not marginal notes, but important scenes of German rule, economic interests, and colonial self-dramatization. In both areas, the German Reich tried to consolidate its power with administration, infrastructure, and economic control. At the same time, the reality there was also characterized by inequality, coercion, and violence. Cameroon and Togo therefore show particularly clearly that colonial rule was not only brutal where there were major wars or open mass murder. Even where it appeared to be more orderly or successful to the outside world, it was based on foreign rule and systematic subordination. Both Cameroon and Togo were declared German protected areas in 1884. As in other regions, colonial rule was entered through treaties, trade interests, and diplomatic protection. German merchants and representatives of trading companies were already active on the West African coast. They maintained trade relations, bought palm oil, ivory, rubber, or other goods, and tried to expand their influence. But here, too, these regions were by no means politically empty or economically undeveloped. On the coast and in the hinterland, there were established societies with their own political systems, trade networks, and regional power relations. The idea that Europe only brought order or economy to these areas through colonial rule was also a colonial legend in West Africa. In Togo, German rule was initially particularly strongly related to the coastal area. The area was located on the Gulf of Guinea and was conveniently located for trade. German representatives concluded treaties with local rulers, which from the German point of view served as the basis of the colony. The development in Cameroon was similar. There too, there was a mixture of trade, diplomatic recognition, and political pressure at the beginning. The German Reich secured its claims against other European powers, and then began to gradually bring the territories under more direct control. The fact that this was done under the term protection once again concealed the actual character of the measure. German property claims and economic interests were protected, not the local population. It soon became apparent that Togo and Cameroon had different functions from a German point of view. Togo was often portrayed as a kind of model colony in the German Empire. German officials and pro-colonial circles liked to describe the area as relatively orderly, economically viable, and administratively successful. This presentation was intended to prove that Germany was able to lead colonies efficiently. Cameroon, on the other hand, was larger, geographically more diverse, and politically more difficult to control. There, the conditions were more complex, the expansion into the hinterland more conflictual, and the economic projects more costly. Nevertheless, the two colonies were united by the same basic mechanism: German rule over non-European societies, legitimized by racist ideas and secured by political and military power. In Togo, the empire began early on with the establishment of colonial administrative structures. District offices, police forces, and local mediators were to ensure that the German orders were also effective outside the coast. The aim was not only to formally own the area, but to actually dominate it. This included the registration of the population, the introduction of taxes, the regulation of trade, and the enforcement of colonial concepts of order. The German administration often cooperated with local authorities, insofar as they were willing or forced to support the colonial power. But this cooperation was never equal. It took place within a power relationship in which the Germans set the rules and local leaders were useful only as long as they did not obstruct colonial interests. Cameroon posed greater challenges for the German administration. The area was not only more extensive, but also included very different landscapes and population groups. From the coast to rainforest zones to more northern regions, there was an area in which various political communities, trade relations, and cultural structures existed. German rule had to be established there at great expense. Expeditions, military advances and treaties served to expand German influence further and further. This repeatedly led to conflicts with the population, because the expansion of colonial power also meant interventions in existing ruling systems and economic relations. Cameroon was therefore not a simply administered area, but an area that had to be actively subjugated and reshaped colonially. As in all colonies, the economy played a central role. Togo and Cameroon were to benefit the German Reich. Agricultural products were particularly important for export, including palm oil, cocoa, cotton, coffee, and rubber. In Cameroon, large plantations were added, for which companies claimed a considerable amount of land. This inevitably led to conflicts, because land was not unused, but part of the economic and social livelihoods of the population. When German companies or settlers were given land for plantations, this often meant displacement, expropriation, or the loss of traditional rights of use. Colonial economy was not based on a neutral market process, but on power. This was particularly evident in Cameroon, where German companies and planting companies played an increasingly important role. Plantation economy was considered a sign of colonial modernity and was politically supported by the empire. But for the local people, it meant hard work, low wages, and often direct coercion. Labor had to be procured, and this was rarely done on a truly voluntary basis. The colonial administration used various means to force the population into the labor market: taxes, work obligations, pressure on local leaders, and in some cases outright violence. Even where employment contracts were formally concluded, the conditions were usually so unequal that there could hardly be any question of real voluntariness. In Togo, the economic structure was somewhat different, but even there, colonial policy aimed to shape production and trade in Germany's interest. The colony was to be managed as efficiently as possible and made economically viable. German officials later often boasted of infrastructure projects, administrative order, and trade growth. In fact, roads were built, railway lines were laid out, and communication networks were improved. Compared to other colonies, Togo in particular was considered an area in which German administration and infrastructure could be presented as successful. But this success came at a price, which the colonized people paid. Infrastructure did not primarily serve their well-being, but rather better control of the country and the faster removal of products. Roads and railways were tools of colonial order. Togo in particular shows a typical problem of colonial historiography. Because there was no war there on the scale of the Herero and Nama genocide or the Maji Maji Uprising, the colony was long portrayed as comparatively harmless. But this view does not go far enough. Even a seemingly orderly colony remains a colony. The population had not decided on its own political future, but was under foreign rule. Taxes were imposed, labor was controlled, economic priorities were set from outside, and racist hierarchies shaped everyday life. Violence was visible not only in spectacular massacres, but also in the everyday structure of coercion and subordination. Racism was just as fundamental in West Africa as it was in the other German colonies. German civil servants, military officers, missionaries, and entrepreneurs saw themselves as representatives of a higher culture and regarded the African population as in need of education, unwilling to work, or politically incapable of self-government. Such prejudices determine not only personal attitudes, but also administrative practice and jurisprudence. Europeans enjoyed privileges, their perspective was considered decisive, and African interests were only taken into account if they were compatible with the goals of the colonial power. Colonial order therefore always meant racial order. Who ruled, who had to obey, and whose rights were restricted was clearly marked along this hierarchy. Missionaries also contributed to colonial penetration. In Togo and Cameroon, they founded schools, churches, and mission stations. From their point of view, this was intended to spread Christian faith and impart education. In fact, mission and colonial rule were often closely connected. Mission schools imparted not only knowledge, but also discipline, subordination, and European norms. At the same time, local beliefs and cultural practices were often devalued. Mission was thus part of a broader project that sought not only political and economic control, but also cultural transformation. Even where missionaries criticized individual grievances, they usually moved within the colonial framework and did not fundamentally question German rule as such. There was also resistance to German rule in Cameroon and Togo. This resistance was not always visible in the form of large, centrally organized uprisings, but often regional, local, and diverse. People refused to work, resisted tax demands, fled colonial access, or opposed military expansion. In Cameroon, the expansion of rule into the hinterland has repeatedly led to violent conflicts. German punitive expeditions were directed against communities that resisted submission. Even the term punitive expedition shows the colonial view. Resistance to foreign rule was not understood as a legitimate defense, but as an offense that had to be punished. In this way, the colonial power legitimized its violence linguistically and politically. In Cameroon in particular, it became clear that economic interests and military force were closely linked. The more the colony was to be opened up for trade, plantations, and raw materials, the more important it became to assert German control over land and labor. In regions that resisted this penetration, the colonial power reacted harshly. Villages were attacked, local power structures were destroyed, and the population was made compliant through intimidation. So violence was not a random slip, but an essential part of colonial expansion. The fact that the German public has long preferred to talk about road construction, administrative reforms, and economic development shows above all how selectively colonial successes were portrayed. At the same time, Cameroon and Togo had an important symbolic function in the German Reich. They served as evidence that Germany was a state capable of acting colonially. Maps, reports, and school materials made the colonies visible in the empire and anchored them in the national consciousness. Togo in particular was often used as a model because the colony was smaller and comparatively easy to manage from a German point of view. This staging was politically useful. It was intended to refute criticism of colonial policy and show that Germany not only ruled in Africa, but was supposedly building. But this narrative ignored the fact that every administrative apparatus, every railway line, and every plantation was based on a system that the population had not voluntarily agreed to. Another important aspect is the role of local societies within the colonial order. German rule was dominant, but it could not directly control every area. Therefore, she was in a certain way dependent on mediation. It used local authorities, middlemen, and other actors to enforce orders or organize economic projects. But this cooperation took place under coercive conditions and often significantly changed the existing balance of power. Some groups were able to gain advantages at times, others were weakened or excluded. Colonial rule was therefore never just a relationship between Germans and a unified African population, but intervened deeply in local structures and reshaped them in the interests of the colonial power. When the First World War began, Togo and Cameroon were also caught up in the maelstrom of global conflicts. Togo was occupied relatively quickly by British and French troops as early as 1914. Cameroon lasted longer, but even there the German rule finally ended in military defeat. With the war, the German colonial empire broke apart. But the end of German control did not mean the end of colonial rule in general. The territories were divided among other European powers or given to them as mandates. For the population, foreign rule changed, but not the basic principle of colonial subordination. This also makes it clear that German colonialism was part of a larger imperial system. Cameroon and Togo are therefore important examples of how colonial rule functioned beyond the most well-known excesses of violence. Here it becomes apparent that colonialism was not only in spectacular catastrophes, but also in administrative routine, economic planning, and infrastructural development. It is precisely because Togo was later often referred to as an orderly model colony that it is so important to look at the actual balance of power. A colony remains a colony, even if it is managed efficiently. The central fact remains: a foreign power ruled over people, influencing their country, their work, their politics, and their future. Cameroon and Togo thus broaden their view of the German colonial empire as a whole. They show that colonial rule could take different forms, depending on the region, economic goal, and political strategy. But in all cases, the core remained the same: heteronomy, racist hierarchy, and economic use under German control. While German Southwest Africa stands above all for settler colonialism and genocide, and German East Africa for large-scale domination and exploitation, Cameroon and Togo make it clear how much even supposedly quieter colonies were based on coercion and inequality. In the next chapter, the view goes beyond Africa. Then it is about the German colonies in the Pacific and China, about island territories, trading bases, and the question of how the German Reich also tried to make its power visible in Asia and Oceania. Chapter 8: The German Colonies in the Pacific and China. When talking about the German colonies, many people first think of Africa. This is understandable, because the largest German possessions in terms of area were located there, and because some of the most serious colonial crimes of the empire took place there. But the German colonial empire went much further. In the Pacific and China, too, the German Reich tried to expand its influence, secure bases, and present itself as a global power. These possessions were geographically distant from each other and very different in their structure, but they followed the same basic imperial idea. Germany not only wanted to be present in Europe and Africa, but also to appear on the world stage as a modern colonial power. It is precisely in these overseas territories that it becomes apparent how much the colonial project of the empire was based on prestige, trade, military presence, and racist domination. In the Pacific, the German colonial territory comprised several island groups and territories, including German New Guinea, the Marshall Islands, the Caroline Islands, the Mariana Islands, Nauru, and for a time Samoa. In addition, there was the leased area of Kiautschou in East Asia with the port of Tsingtao in today's China. These areas were not simply a random collection of distant outposts, but part of a larger strategy. The German Reich was looking for trading posts, naval bases, sources of raw materials, and visible signs of imperial presence. Precisely because Germany had entered colonialism relatively late, the Reich felt the need to demonstrate its claim to world prestige in a particularly demonstrative way. In the Pacific and East Asia, therefore, it was not only about immediate economic gain, but also about the symbolic presence of German power. German New Guinea was the largest German possession in the Pacific. The area included the northeastern part of the island of New Guinea, as well as the Bismarck Archipelago with islands such as New Britain, New Ireland, and other surrounding areas. The acquisition of these territories began in the 1880s, initially again strongly influenced by private colonial initiatives. An important role was played by the New Guinea Company, an enterprise that pursued colonial interests on behalf of and with the support of the empire. As in Africa, the German Reich initially tried to outsource some of its power to private companies. These were to take over administration, economic development, and control, without the state having to bear all the costs from the beginning. But here, too, it soon became apparent that colonial rule could hardly function in the long term without direct state intervention. From the outset, Germany's presence in New Guinea and on the surrounding islands was linked to the idea of opening up economically usable areas there. Plantation economy played an important role. In particular, coconut products, copra, and other export goods were in the spotlight. In addition, there were hopes for raw materials, trade advantages, and strategic positions. However, as always in the colonial context, economic development did not simply mean neutral development, but interventions in existing life worlds. The societies living there had their own political structures, cultural traditions, and economic forms. However, the colonial power did not treat them as equal actors, but as a population whose land, labor, and living space were to be integrated into a German system of rule and economy. The islands of the Pacific posed special challenges for the German colonial administration. The areas were far apart, difficult to control, and only managed with limited personnel effort. This is precisely why the empire often relied on indirect methods of rule: local intermediaries, mission stations, trading companies, and smaller administrative centers. But even if the control remained selective, this did not change the colonial character of the rule. Treaties, protective claims, and formal claims of ownership served to create the impression of legitimate German sovereignty. In fact, this sovereignty was based on military superiority, international agreements among colonial powers, and racist ideas of European entitlement to rule. Another important element of German Pacific policy was Samoa. The Samoa conflict shows particularly clearly how strongly colonial rule in the Pacific was linked to international competition. At the end of the 19th century, Samoa was a territory over which several powers competed, especially Germany, the USA, and Great Britain. It was not only about local trade, but also about strategic influence in the Pacific. After prolonged tensions and conflicts, Samoa was finally divided between Germany and the USA in 1899. The western part fell to Germany, the eastern part to the United States. This process alone shows the colonial core of imperial policy. The future of a country was decided by external powers, not by the population itself. German rule in Samoa was later portrayed as milder or more efficient than in other colonies. In fact, the administration there tried to take certain local structures into account and not always deal with conflicts openly militarily. But even this comparatively soft form remains colonial rule. The German Reich determined the political framework, controlled economic interests, and placed German authority above Samoan self-determination. Even where colonial administration was more pragmatic, the fundamental balance of power remained untouched. The difference was more in the methods than in the principle. In addition to New Guinea and Samoa, the German Pacific Empire included other island groups such as the Marshall Islands, the Caroline Islands, and the Mariana Islands. These territories were acquired partly by purchase, partly by international agreements or diplomatic agreements. In particular, the acquisition of Spanish Pacific Islands after the decline of Spain shows how much colonial policy functioned as a shift of ownership claims between European powers and other imperial states. Islands were, in a sense, transferred, sold, or reassigned, as if they were objects on a political map. The people living there hardly played a role in these decisions. This also shows the arrogance of imperial thinking. Territories were treated as if they could pass from one power to another without the affected population having a right to have a say. Economically, many of these Pacific regions were only partially profitable for the German Reich. Precisely for this reason, their importance must not be measured solely by direct profits. For the German Empire, they were also an expression of presence on the world's oceans and part of a strategy of maritime power. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the German Empire pursued an intensive expansion of the fleet. In this context, overseas bases gained in importance. Colonies in the Pacific could serve as supply and trading stations and help to create the image of an empire capable of acting globally. The Pacific was therefore not only an economic area, but also a stage for imperial self-expression. This self-portrayal was closely linked to a specific colonial view of the people of the Pacific. German reports, travel descriptions, and colonial accounts often exoticized the inhabitants of the islands. They appeared to the German public either as noble savages, as childishly naive nature people, or as culturally backward groups in need of European leadership. Such images may have seemed less openly belligerent than the language about African uprisings, but they were no less problematic. Here, too, a hierarchy was created in which Europeans appeared as superior, ordering, and civilizing. The Pacific was thus not only politically colonized, but also culturally and imaginarily fitted into a European worldview. Missionaries played a particularly visible role in the Pacific regions. They founded schools, churches, and mission stations and made a significant contribution to cultural transformation. From their point of view, it was about religious conversion and moral education. But here, too, mission cannot be separated from colonial power. Missionaries did not always work identically with the colonial administration, but they often supported the spread of European norms and the devaluation of local beliefs. Christianity, schooling, and discipline were often understood as elements of a comprehensive civilization. In doing so, they were part of the colonial project that wanted to change not only the country and the economy, but also ways of life. The combination of imperial prestige and strategic thinking was even clearer than in the Pacific in the Chinese leased territory of Kiautschou. German access to this area took place in 1897 at a time when several Western powers and Japan were expanding their influence in China. The German Reich used the murder of 2 German missionaries in Shandong province as a pretext to intervene militarily and occupy the area around Kiautschou Bay. In 1898, Germany received a lease agreement from China for the area. This did not formally create a complete colony in the classical sense, but in fact a German area of rule was created on Chinese soil. The center of Kiautschou was Tsingtao, today's Qingdao. The city was deliberately developed by the Germans into a modern port and administrative center. Roads, administrative buildings, military installations, residential districts and port infrastructure should not only serve practical purposes, but also represent a visible sign of German performance. Tsingtao was often celebrated in the German Empire as a prime example of German order, technology and urbanity. The city was considered a showcase of colonial modernity. In it, the German Reich wanted to show that it was capable of establishing a modern, clean and efficiently organized enclave in East Asia as well. But here, too, the gleaming facade of colonial modernity must not obscure the balance of power. Kiautschou was not a voluntary German development project, but the result of imperial pressure. China was in a phase of massive weakening of foreign policy, in which Western powers and Japan were forcing zones of influence, trade privileges, and leased areas. The German rule in Kiautschou was thus part of a broader imperial penetration of China. The fact that Germany built roads, modernized ports, and established administrative structures, there did not change the fact that it was foreign rule based on unequal power relations. In Kiautschou in particular, colonial rule was closely linked to a military presence. The German Navy played a central role, and the port was of strategic importance for East Asia. Unlike some Pacific islands, Kiautschou was not just a symbolic possession, but an active base in a geopolitically important region. From there, the empire wanted to promote trade, secure influence, and support its naval policy. Kiautschou thus became an important building block of German world politics. It showed that the empire not only held possession somewhere, but also wanted to get involved in one of the most important regions of the world. The German presence in China was also closely linked to the colonial ideology of the time. Chinese society and politics were often judged condescendingly from a European perspective, although China looked back on thousands of years of high culture. The colonial gaze was flexible enough to devalue even highly developed societies if it served imperial interests. The assertion of Western superiority here was not in the idea of encountering completely uncivilized spaces, but in the conviction that European powers had the right to dominate China economically and politically. Here, too, lies an important insight. Colonialism was not only directed against supposedly backward societies, but against any order that stood in the way of European power. A particularly striking event in this context was the Boxer Rebellion of 1900. The uprising was directed against the growing foreign influence in China and thus also against the German presence. The German Reich took part in the international military intervention to suppress the movement. In this context, Kaiser Wilhelm II gave his infamous Hun speech, in which he called on German soldiers to be ruthlessly harsh. This speech makes it clear how closely colonial politics were linked to an open will to violence. Even though Kiautschou was often portrayed as a modern model city, Germany's East Asia policy was by no means only characterized by trade and construction projects, but also by military aggression and racially charged violence. If you look at the German colonies in the Pacific and China together, it becomes clear how multifaceted the colonial project of the empire was. It ranged from island groups with loose but nevertheless dominant rule to plantation areas to a highly staged port base in East Asia. Everywhere it was about influence, control, and the visibility of German power. The shapes differed, but the core remained the same. Germany claimed spaces that did not belong to it, subordinated them to its interests, and justified this with the typical ideologies of imperialism: progress, civilization, order, and national greatness. These colonies also show that the German Empire understood colonial policy not only as an economic necessity, but as part of a larger self-image. Germany wanted to be a world power, and world power at that time meant navy, colonies, bases, and visible global presence. Especially the scattered possessions in the Pacific and the leased territory in China were symbols of this claim. They were intended to show that the empire could act across continents, act militarily, and be culturally formative. In reality, they were an expression of a system based on inequality, foreign domination, and the exclusion of those affected. Thus, the German colonies in the Pacific and China once again demonstrate that colonialism was far more than mere land grabbing. It was a global project of power that combined political domination, economic interests, cultural transformation, and military presence. Even where violence seemed less visible or where colonial modernity was particularly emphasized, the basic reality remained the same. A European power overrode other societies and shaped their future according to its own ideas. The next chapter is therefore about colonial everyday life itself, about administration, proselytizing, and racism. Because in order to really understand the German colonial empire, it is not enough to just look at maps and territorial gains. It is also crucial how rule was organized, experienced, and secured in everyday life. Chapter 9: Colonial Life, Administration, Missionary Work, and Racism. When colonialism is discussed, the focus is often on major political decisions, military conquests, or dramatic uprisings. This is understandable, because the violence of colonial rule is particularly open there. But a colonial empire did not only consist of wars, borders, and treaties. It also consisted of everyday life. Especially in everyday life, rule became permanently effective. It showed how control was organized, how inequality was normalized, and how power was inscribed into people's lives. Everyday colonial life in the German colonies was not a sideshow, but the actual foundation of the system. Administration, proselytizing, and racism intertwined and formed an order in which European superiority was not only asserted, but practically enforced day after day. The term everyday life sounds unspectacular at first. You might think of routine, habits, recurring routines. This is precisely what makes it so important for colonial history. Rule is particularly stable when it is not only visible in exceptional situations, but is reflected in everyday rules, encounters, institutions, and self-evident things. In the German colonies, this meant that those who were allowed to move freely, who could own land, who had to work, who were punished, who were vindicated in court, who received education, and who was allowed to decide over others. All this was part of a colonial everyday life that was characterized by racial hierarchy. The violence of colonial rule lay not only in military campaigns, but also in precisely this permanent normalization of inequality. The colonial administration played a central role in this. It was the organizational backbone of German rule. Governors, district magistrates, judges, police forces, and various subordinate officials were to ensure that the Reich's claim actually took effect. In the conception of the colonial power, administration meant order, rationality, and modernity. German civil servants often saw themselves as the bearers of a superior state culture. They believed that they were bringing a system of law, discipline, and efficiency to supposedly confusing or backward spaces. But this self-description was misleading. The administration did not serve the neutral common good, but to secure colonial interests. It was an instrument of domination. This rule began with registration. The population was counted, regions were surveyed, economic activities were observed, and local power structures were catalogued. At first glance, such measures seemed technocratic, but they had far-reaching political consequences. Anyone who captures people makes them governable. Those who measure land can better tax, distribute, or expropriate it. Those who appoint local leaders can control, replace, or incorporate them into their own order. Administration was therefore never neutral, but a means that translated colonial knowledge into colonial power. The Germans not only wanted to own the colonies, but also to be able to read, order, and dominate them. An important instrument of this administration was the introduction of taxes. In many colonies, people had to pay poll taxes, hut taxes, or other levies. These taxes had several functions at the same time. They brought in revenue and strengthened the authority of the colonial power, but above all they forced many people into the colonial money cycle. Those who had to pay in money needed access to wage labor or to sell products on markets that were characterized by the colonial economy. In this way, people who had previously lived in other economic contexts were forced into jobs that served the needs of the empire. The tax was therefore not only an administrative instrument, but a lever of forced economic adjustment. The work regulations are closely related to this. In all German colonies, work was a key issue. Roads had to be built, plantations operated, goods transported, administrative centers supplied, and infrastructure maintained. But the population was often opposed to this work, for good reasons. The conditions were harsh, the pay low, the treatment condescending, and the activities were usually not in their own interest. Therefore, the colonial power tried to make labor systematically available. This was done through taxes, recruitment, pressure on local authorities, forced contracts, and in many cases, open violence. For many people, everyday colonial life was therefore an everyday life of work discipline. This discipline was secured by punishments. Physical violence was an integral part of everyday life in the German colonies. Flogging, arrest, humiliation, and other forms of direct punishment were common. What was called order or education in the colonial administration was often crude submission. For many German civil servants and entrepreneurs, corporal punishment was seen as a legitimate means of enforcing work, demonstrating authority, or sanctioning disobedience. The fact that such punishments against European citizens would hardly have been conceivable in this form already shows the racist core of the system. African and Pacific populations were not treated as equal legal subjects, but as people whose bodies the colonial power believed it was allowed to dispose of to a large extent. The legal system was also part of this inequality. In the colonies, there was not simply universal law for all, but an order with clear differences. Europeans had different rights, different procedural options, and often de facto greater protection than the native population. In court, the testimony of a German often counted more than that of a colonized. In addition, European legal concepts were used as a benchmark, while local norms and forms of conflict resolution were only recognized if they were compatible with colonial rule. Colonial law thus did not create a space of justice, but of hierarchy. It gave rule a legal framework and made inequality seemingly formal. Many areas of everyday life were also organized through indirect rule. The Germans were usually unable to rule the colonies alone with their own personnel. Therefore, they worked with local authorities or made certain people mediators of colonial power. These local leaders, interpreters, police forces, or administrative assistants had a difficult relationship with the colonial power. Some tried to preserve their own room for maneuver, others benefited from the proximity to the administration at times, and still others were seen by the population as an extended arm of foreign rule. This constellation makes it clear that everyday colonial life did not only consist of a simple contrast between Germans and colonized, but also changed existing social structures and used them for their own purposes. In addition to administration, missionary work was a second central element of colonial everyday life. Missionaries were among the most visible European actors in many German colonies. They founded schools, churches, boarding schools, workshops, and infirmaries. In their own perception, they brought faith, morality, and education. In fact, their roles were different, and not all missionaries thought or acted in the same way. Some criticized individual excesses of colonial violence, others made an effort to acquire language and cultural knowledge, and still others worked closely with state agencies. But despite these differences, missions were part of the overall colonial context. They made a significant contribution to portraying European norms and values as superior and devaluing local ways of life. This is particularly evident in the area of schools. Mission schools taught reading, writing, and religious content, but they were much more than places of education in the neutral sense. They formed behavior, language, and self-images. Children and young people should not only learn something, but be educated to be obedient, Christian, and industrious subjects. Local languages have often been pushed back, traditional religious practices have been condemned, and European ways of life have been presented as desirable. Education was thus also a means of cultural transformation. The lessons not only imparted knowledge, but also a colonial order of the world. Missionary work had a profound impact on family life, gender roles, and social relationships. Christian ideas of marriage, moral norms, and educational ideals were introduced or demanded. Local religious practices, rites, and authorities were often portrayed as pagan, superstitious, or inferior. Those who followed missionary norms could count on certain advantages, such as access to schools, medical care, or protective relationships. This created new social dynamics within the colonized societies. Some accepted missionary offers out of conviction, others for pragmatic reasons, and still others resisted. But in any case, the mission was a place where cultural power was exercised. In this context, medical institutions cannot simply be understood as purely humanitarian projects. Although missionaries and colonial administrations did indeed provide medical aid in some cases, medicine was also part of the colonial order. It was able to create trust, create dependencies, and demonstrate the superiority of European forms of knowledge. The colonial claim was not only to rule politically and to use it economically, but also to define what was to be considered a healthy, reasonable, and civilized way of life. Even seemingly charitable institutions must therefore be seen in the context of power. The third major area of colonial everyday life was racism. He combined administration and missionary work into a comprehensive system. Racism was not just an opinion or prejudice of individual people. It was a way of thinking that structured the entire colonial space. He determined how people were seen, categorized, and treated. In the German colonies, Europeans were regarded as bearers of reason, order, and culture, while the native population was regarded as childish, instinctive, uncivilized, or unwilling to work. Such attributions were not mere words. They justified political paternalism, economic exploitation, and physical violence. Racism shaped the view of work. When Africans or other colonized people refused to work on plantations or in road construction, this was often understood not as a reasonable rejection of bad conditions, but as proof of alleged laziness. When people resisted, it was not seen as a legitimate defense against foreign rule, but as a sign of savagery or backwardness. When German officials acted brutally, they could justify it to themselves as necessary discipline. Racism thus made violence not only possible, but also morally acceptable in the eyes of many colonial actors. This way of thinking was also evident in the private and social life of the colonies. European settlers, civil servants, and entrepreneurs often lived in spatially and socially demarcated areas. Residential areas, clubs, traffic rules, and manners reflected the colonial hierarchy. Even where there were everyday contacts, it was clearly marked who ordered and who obeyed. Clothing, language, housing, and access to certain places became signs of social and racial order. Colonial everyday life, therefore, also consisted of symbols of superiority. Rule was made visible, not only through laws and weapons, but through spaces, gestures, and rituals. A particularly sensitive issue in this context was relationships between European men and native women. In the early colonial period, such relationships did occur, often under very unequal conditions. But over time, the German Reich tried harder to draw racial boundaries. The fear of so-called mixing grew. Relationships, marriages, and children from such unions were increasingly problematized. Behind this was the idea that the colonial order must also be secured biologically and socially. This is precisely where it becomes clear how comprehensive colonial racism was. It regulated not only political rule, but also intimacy, family, and belonging. Racism did not only have an effect in the colonies themselves, but was closely linked to the German Reich. In newspapers, school textbooks, exhibitions, and so-called ethnological exhibitions. People from the colonies were exoticized and devalued. These images shaped the perception in Germany, and in turn supported the behavior of the colonial actors on the ground. Colonial life was therefore never just a local affair in Africa, the Pacific, or China. It was connected to a society in Europe that supported, consumed, and often took for granted colonial rule. It is important to note that everyday colonial life never functioned completely without contradiction. The colonized humans were not simply passive objects of this order. They developed a variety of ways of dealing with colonial rule. Some adapted in order to survive or to take advantage of certain advantages. Others withdrew where possible. Still others openly resisted. Refusal to work, flight, adherence to one's own religious practices, the reinterpretation of missionary content, or the use of colonial institutions for one's own purposes were also part of everyday life. Colonial rule was therefore dominant, but never omnipotent. It had to be constantly manufactured, defended, and resecured. This is precisely why a look at everyday life is so revealing. It shows that colonialism consisted not only of extraordinary acts of violence, but of a lasting order of inequality. Administration made people governable and economically usable. Missionary work intervened in thinking, faith, and education. Racism gave the whole thing an ideological basis and made the hierarchy seemingly self-evident. Together, these areas formed a system in which domination could be deeply inscribed in everyday life. This finding is crucial for German colonial history, because it prevents violence from appearing only as an exception. The great crimes of colonialism were not separated from the rest of the rule. They grew out of an everyday life in which subordination, devaluation, and coercion were already normalized. Anyone who disenfranchises, disciplines, and treats people as inferior on a daily basis creates the conditions for extreme violence to become easier later on. Colonial everyday life was therefore not the harmless reverse side of the conquest, but its permanent foundation. The next chapter is logically about the economic side of this system: plantations, raw materials, and forced labor. Administration, proselytizing, and racism served not least to make the colonies usable for the German Reich. Behind the idea of order and civilization, there has always been an interest in profit, control over resources, and the availability of cheap labor. Chapter 10: Economic Interests, Plantations, Raw Materials, and Forced Labor. Colonialism was never just a political or military project. It has always been an economic system. Behind the big words of civilization, order, and national greatness were very concrete interests: land, raw materials, trade advantages, markets, and cheap labor. In the German colonial empire, too, the economic use of the colonies was one of the central goals. The possessions in Africa, the Pacific, and China were not only intended to give the empire prestige, but also to bring material benefits. This is precisely why landscapes have been surveyed, transport routes built, workers recruited, and local economies reshaped. Anyone who wants to understand the German colonies must therefore understand their economic logic. For it was precisely in the economy that it became particularly clear that colonial rule was based on exploitation. From the point of view of the empire and many colonial supporters, the colonies were supposed to fulfill several economic functions. They were to supply raw materials that were needed in Germany. They were to enrich German companies. They were to serve as markets for industrial products, and they were to show that Germany also participated in the global economic and power competition. In the age of imperialism, economic expansion was considered a feature of modern states. Those who had overseas territories could access valuable resources and at the same time strengthen their position in the international competition. Colonies were therefore not only seen as a geographical extension, but as economic areas that were to be made usable in the interests of the motherland. The idea that colonies were inherently untapped reservoirs of wealth was a typical colonial illusion. The territories that Germany ruled in Africa or the Pacific were by no means economically empty. People lived there who farmed, kept livestock, hunted, fished, traded, produced, and had their own regional exchange networks. Colonial economy therefore did not mean making fallow areas productive for the first time, but rebuilding existing forms of life and economy according to European interests. This conversion was rarely peaceful and almost never voluntary. It presupposed that land, labor, and production would be forced into a new order. This is exactly where the real history of colonial economics begins. The state played a central role. Without land, there are no plantations. Without land, there is no extraction of raw materials. Without land, there are no settlement projects. In almost all German colonies, the appropriation of land was therefore one of the first and most important steps. In doing so, the colonial power relied on treaties, surveys, expropriations, military occupation, or legal concepts that placed European concepts of property above local forms of use. What appeared to be a lawful acquisition from the German point of view often meant the loss of pastures, fields, forests, water points, and thus their own livelihood from the point of view of the affected population. For many societies, land was not only possession in the material sense, but also part of social order, community, and cultural identity. When the colonial power transformed land into plantation areas, settlement areas, or concession areas, it destroyed far more than just economic routines. This was particularly visible in the plantation system. In colonial thinking, plantations were considered a symbol of modernity, efficiency, and economic progress. Large areas should be cultivated with few products for export. In the German colonies, different goods were grown depending on the region: cocoa, coffee, cotton, sisal, rubber, coconut palm products, tobacco, and other products. Such cultivation zones were created in Cameroon, Togo, German East Africa, and the Pacific. German companies, plantation companies, and settlers were given access to land and labor, often with the direct support of the colonial administration. However, these plantations were not neutral economic enterprises, but core elements of colonial rule. They presupposed that land was made available and people were moved or forced to work. The violence behind the economic project was particularly evident on the labor issue. For colonial plantation economy was unthinkable without cheap and as controllable labor as possible. But many people had little interest in working under the conditions of the colonial economy. The work was hard, poorly paid, often far away from one's own living environment and associated with humiliation, punishment, and insecurity. Therefore, the state and companies resorted to means that went far beyond ordinary work incentives. Taxes forced people into the circulation of money. Work obligations were imposed. Local authorities were pressured to provide workers. In some cases, people were forcibly recruited or forced into jobs that were only voluntary on paper. In the colonial context, the boundary between wage labor and forced labor was often fluid, and often deliberately blurred. German East Africa is a particularly clear example of this. There, the Germans wanted to build up an export-oriented agricultural economy, including cotton and sisal. To do this, they needed workers in large numbers. Many people were forced into the colonial labor order by taxes and administrative requirements. The state not only wanted to generate tax revenues, but also to create a targeted supply of work. Those who needed money had to work on plantations, transport goods, or support infrastructure projects. In particular, the forced cultivation of cotton showed how ruthlessly economic interests were enforced. In some regions, farmers had to grow cotton, even though this put a strain on their own food supply and massively changed their everyday lives. The colonial economy thus intervened directly in the production of food, in family structures, and in the distribution of labor power. Plantation farming also played an important role in Cameroon. There, German companies claimed large areas for cocoa, rubber, and palm products. The colonial administration supported this development by making land available, suppressing local resistance, and making labor available. For the local people, this often meant the loss of their rights of use and dependence on a labor market that they had not created themselves. Particularly problematic was the fact that plantations were considered places of extreme discipline. Hard physical labor, poor accommodation, low pay, and corporal punishment were part of the system in many places. Even though the colonial power liked to talk about contract and order, in practice plantation operations were often based on intimidation and coercion. In Togo, a similar pattern emerged, albeit often on a smaller or more administratively controlled scale. Later, the colony was often portrayed as a prime example of colonial development, but even their infrastructure was mainly used for export, and even their economic use was not possible without interference in the lives of the population. When roads and railway lines were built, it was not first to provide better mobility for the local population, but to transport agricultural products faster and more efficiently. Infrastructure was therefore part of economic exploitation. It connected production sites with ports, administrative centers with plantations, and military control with economic development. Raw materials also played a central role. Colonial territories were constantly questioned about what they could deliver to the empire. This applied not only to agricultural products, but also to mineral raw materials. In German Southwest Africa, for example, mining and diamond mining in particular later gained great importance. Other mineral resources, ores or valuable materials were also of interest. Where such resources were discovered, colonial penetration usually intensified particularly quickly. After all, raw material extraction required access to land, transport routes, security structures, and workers. Once again, it became clear that economic benefits were not simply there, but had to be enforced and organized by domination. This economic logic did not only affect large companies, but was closely linked to the state. The German colonial state was not a neutral arbiter between private interests and the local population. He was at the center of the system of exploitation. The administration regulated taxes, set work specifications, secured property claims, and used military means when economic interests were endangered. Colonial economy was therefore never simply a private economy under a foreign sky, but an interaction between companies, civil servants, the military, and political decision-makers. It was precisely this close alliance that made the system so effective. Companies could rely on state power, while the state, in turn, justified its presence with economic benefits. Of course, there were also discussions within Germany about whether the colonies were really economically worthwhile. Not all colonies were equally profitable, and administrative costs were high. Critics pointed out that the colonies cost the state more than they brought in. But such objections do little to change the character of the system. Even where the economic balance for the Reich as a whole was mixed, this did not mean that exploitation did not take place. On the contrary, it was precisely because they wanted to make the colonies profitable that the pressure on land, labor, and production became all the greater. The question of whether a colonial empire was profitable from the state's point of view is therefore not the same as the question of whether people were exploited locally. This exploitation was real, regardless of how successful or unsuccessful individual colonial companies were in their accounts. An important aspect was also the conversion of local farming methods. Many companies in the German colonies initially produced primarily for their own needs or for regional markets. With colonial rule, this structure was often shifted. Export products gained in importance, subsistence farming was put under pressure, and traditional trade relations were weakened. This could have profound consequences. If farmers had to spend more time on cotton or other export goods, there was no time for growing food. When men were recruited on plantations or for porter services, it changed the lives of entire families and village communities. When land was reserved for plantations, competition for arable land intensified. Colonial economy was therefore not only a system of exploitation, but also one of social destruction. This was particularly drastic in connection with hunger and hardship, where colonial cultivation obligations or forced labor undermined food security. Entire regions could be plunged into crises. The Maji Maji Uprising in German East Africa is precisely in this context. German colonial policy had put people in a situation in which their livelihoods were massively threatened through taxes, cotton cultivation, and coercion. When the uprising broke out, the colonial power reacted with a scorched earth policy. Fields were destroyed, supplies destroyed, villages burned down. As a result, countless people died not only from direct violence, but also from the consequences of economic destruction. Here it becomes particularly clear how closely economy and violence were linked in colonialism. The economy was not the peaceful side of the system, but itself a field of brutal rule. In German Southwest Africa, too, economic interest was combined with extreme violence. There it was not only about raw materials and livestock farming, but above all about land for settlers and companies. The displacement of the Herero and Nama from their livelihoods was economically motivated, racially justified, and politically wanted. After the genocide, surviving people were often forced into jobs that took place under catastrophic conditions. The expropriation of the victims' land directly served colonial economic interests. This also shows that economic exploitation and the most open violence were not separate chapters, but belonged together. The transport sector was another important field of colonial economy. In many areas, goods had to be transported over long distances before railway lines were built. Sponsors were recruited for this purpose, often under duress. For many people, porter services mean heavy physical strain, long absences from home, and high health risks. Later, roads, railways, and ports were expanded, but this infrastructure was also based on hard work and served primarily colonial goals. From the colonial powers' point of view, economic development meant more efficient access to products, raw materials, and labor. It was not a matter of development based on the needs of the population, but of the functioning of the colonial system. The German public often perceived this economic side in a distorted way. In reports, exhibitions, and newspaper articles, colonies were often presented as future areas of the German economy. There was talk of trade opportunities, development, and progress. Plantations, ports, and railways were considered evidence of German energy. But rarely has it been openly said that this progress was due to land loss, forced labor, and violent discipline. In Germany, colonial economics often appeared as a factual modernization project, although in reality it was only possible through structural oppression. It was precisely this trivialization that was an important part of the system. It allowed profits and prestige to be celebrated without focusing on the human cost. It is also important to note that economic interests did not only concern material goods, but also shaped the perception of the colonies themselves. Regions were judged on what they were worth. People were evaluated according to whether they were useful as workers. Landscapes were described according to their plantation potential or their raw material deposit. Colonial thinking transformed entire societies and living spaces into economic categories. This is precisely where a profound form of dehumanization lies. Anyone who sees a space only as a raw material store or plantation area loses sight of the people who live there and of their own claims to land, dignity, and future. It can be said that German colonial rule was economically motivated and economically organized. But this economy was not simply a market, but a system of domination. It was based on land grabbing, on the restructuring of local modes of production, on fiscal and administrative pressures, and on various forms of forced labor. Plantations, raw material extraction, and infrastructure projects were not neutral signs of development, but instruments of exploitation. Colonial wealth, insofar as it arose, was not jointly earned and distributed fairly, but was made possible by a power imbalance in which German interests counted and the population of the colonies was subordinate. Precisely for this reason, economic history must always be understood in this context as a history of violence. The profit logic of colonialism could not be separated from the military and racist logic. If you want to force work, appropriate land, and control production, you have to control people. If they resist, repression follows. Economy and violence were therefore not two separate areas in the German colonial empire, but closely linked. The seemingly sober terms plantation, export, or infrastructure often conceal a history of coercion, uprooting, and suffering. In the next chapter, therefore, the resistance against this rule becomes more of a focus. For the people in the German colonies did not simply accept exploitation, loss of land and oppression in silence. They defended themselves, with open uprisings, with refusal, with flight, and with many other forms of resistance. It is precisely this resistance that shows that colonial rule was never a matter of course, but always had to be enforced against the interests of the ruled. Chapter 11. Resistance to German colonial rule. In many older accounts, colonial rule often appears as a one-sided process. European powers are invading foreign territories, establishing administration, creating military control, and reshaping the occupied regions according to their ideas. In such narratives, the focus is often on the colonizers, their decisions, their expeditions, their governors, their infrastructure, their economic projects. But this view is incomplete and ultimately misleading. For colonial rule was never simply a trouble-free march of European power. It met with resistance everywhere. In the German colonies, too, people resisted foreign rule, land grabbing, forced labor, political incapacitation, and racist oppression. This resistance was diverse, regionally different, and not always successful in the military sense. But he was a central part of the story. Without him, German colonial rule cannot be understood. Even the term resistance must be understood broadly. One often thinks first of armed uprisings, battles, and military confrontation. Such forms did indeed exist, and some of them shook the German colonial empire deeply. But resistance often began much earlier and was present in everyday life. It manifested itself in the refusal to recognize treaties, in the rejection of tax demands, in the flight from recruitment, in the refusal of work, in the adherence to one's own religious or political structures, and in the search for alliances against the colonial power. Resistance could be open, hidden, collective, or individual. It could be militarily organized or consist of silent forms of withdrawal. Precisely because colonial rule intervened in so many areas of life, resistance also arose on many levels. It is no coincidence that there was so much resistance at all. For the people concerned, colonial rule did not just mean a change of administration or new trade contacts. It meant a massive encroachment on political self-determination, economic livelihoods, and social orders. Land was taken, work was forced, taxes were imposed, traditional authorities were disempowered or instrumentalized, religious practices were devalued, and everyday life was regulated by a foreign power. For many communities, it was quickly apparent that the Germans did not come as partners, but as rulers. Those who resisted this did so not out of irrational hostility or alleged backwardness, as German colonial reports often portrayed, but out of an understandable desire to defend freedom, dignity, and livelihoods. An early example of this is the resistance in German East Africa in the late 1880s. When German representatives began to exert influence on the East African coast and to suppress existing power relations, considerable resistance arose. The population reacted to the threat of German control not with approval, but with open surveys. In older German sources, this conflict was often portrayed in a distorted way, as if it had only been supported by individual Arab or coastal elites. In fact, it was broader and an expression of rejection of colonial interference. A typical pattern can already be seen here. The Germans often interpreted resistance in such a way that it appeared as a disturbance of legitimate order, not as a defense against illegitimate foreign rule. This reinterpretation was important because it helped to justify brutal countermeasures. In West Africa, too, German expansion did not meet with unobjectionable acceptance. In Cameroon, for example, the expansion of German rule into the hinterland was only possible through military pressure. Local communities and political units defended their interests, resisted foreign claims, or refused to be integrated into a German administrative system. Resistance could be regionally limited, but it is precisely these local conflicts that show that colonial rule had to be enforced again and again on the ground. The German reaction consisted mostly of so-called punitive expeditions. The term alone betrays the perspective of the colonial power. It was not the colonial violence that appeared as a problem, but the resistance of the ruled, which had to be punished as an offense. In this way, military repression was linguistically normalized. In Togo, German rule often seemed more orderly and seemingly stable to the outside world. But even there was no resistance-free colony. People refused to work, evaded taxes, evaded state intervention, or resisted interference in their way of life. Especially in colonies that were later portrayed as efficient or successful, it is important to make the quieter forms of resistance visible. Because not every resistance led to a major armed uprising. Sometimes it consisted of only superficially following colonial rules, circumventing work requirements, avoiding other villages or groups, or evading spatial and social control. This was also resistance, less spectacular, but historically significant. The resistance of colonized societies in German Southwest Africa became particularly clear. There, the situation was exacerbated by land grabbing, debts, livestock losses, racist humiliation, and growing pressure from German settlers and officials. It became increasingly clear to the Herero that the German colonial order was not aimed at togetherness, but at their repression and subjugation. Their resistance was therefore not sudden or incomprehensible, but the result of years of escalation. The same was true later for the Nama. This reveals a central truth of colonial history. Uprisings do not arise out of nowhere. They grow out of concrete experiences of injustice and threat. Anyone who only looks at the moment of the uprising, but ignores the long history of deprivation of rights, inadvertently adopts the perspective of the colonial power. Resistance was often closely linked to local leaders, but it was rarely the work of individuals. Leaders such as Samuel Maharero among the Herero or Hendrik Witbooi among the Nama undoubtedly played important roles because they provided political orientation, forged alliances, or developed military strategies. But their influence was based on the fact that many people recognized the danger of German rule themselves and were willing to oppose it. Colonial resistance was thus both politically organized and socially supported. He combined leadership, communal experience, and the defense of concrete vital interests. Resistance was not always uniform. In many regions, there were different assessments of how to deal with the colonial power. Some local authorities initially tried to negotiate with the Germans or temporarily adapt to prevent worse. Others sought alliances with rival groups or hoped to preserve room for maneuver through cooperation. Still others pleaded for open resistance early on. These differences were not a sign of weakness, but an expression of the difficult situation in which many societies found themselves. Colonial rule forced people to make decisions under pressure. The fact that there was not always a uniform course shows the complexity of the situation. Nevertheless, the basic fact remained: German rule was contested and challenged on many levels. A crucial aspect of the resistance was the defense of land. For many African societies, land was not only an economic resource, but also the basis of belonging, memory, political order, and social life. If the colonial power wanted to measure land, divide it up and give it to settlers or companies, it would threaten the foundations of entire communities. Resistance to colonial land grabbing was therefore particularly intense. In German Southwest Africa, it was precisely this conflict that ultimately led to disaster. But in other colonies, too, the question of land was always a question of power. Who controlled the land, controlled production, movement, settlement, and future. Equally central was resistance to forced labor and colonial economic measures. People resisted recruitment for plantations, road construction, or porter services. They fled from work detachments, sabotaged work processes, retreated to regions that were difficult to control, or used every opportunity to circumvent colonial requirements. Especially where the state wanted to force labor through taxes, the rejection of the labor regime became a political form of resistance. In the colonial system, work was never just economic activity, but an expression of subordination. Anyone who evaded this work also withdrew from a part of the rule. Religious and cultural forms were also able to gain resistance importance. Missionary work and cultural paternalism were deeply involved in the colonial project. Therefore, adherence to one's own religious traditions, symbols, and forms of community was often more than mere loyalty to tradition. It could be a conscious or unconscious refusal to adopt colonial interpretations of the world. In some cases, religious ideas were even directly linked to political resistance. People sought hope, legitimacy, and cohesion in spiritual narratives or shared rituals. Such forms were particularly important for the mobilization of resistance because they could have a unifying effect across ethnic, local, or linguistic boundaries. However, resistance was not only a reaction to violence, but often also an expression of one's own ability to act politically. Too often, colonized people were portrayed only as victims in older narratives. This conceals their active role. Many communities analyzed the situation, made strategic decisions, sought alliances, observed the weaknesses of the colonial power, and developed their own forms of warfare or refusal. They did not act merely out of desperation, but often with a clear political goal: the preservation of autonomy, the defense of land, the limitation of foreign interference, or the restoration of their own rule. Even though they were often inferior to German military power, their resistance was an expression of sovereignty. The German colonial power almost always reacted to resistance with harshness. This is another reason why resistance is so important for understanding colonial rule. For the brutality of the German reactions shows how unstable this rule actually was. It was not based on general recognition, but had to be enforced militarily again and again. Protection troops, police forces, punitive expeditions, and states of emergency were not marginal phenomena, but central components of the system. The more determined the resistance, the more clearly the true character of colonial rule was revealed. The Germans did not react like a legitimate government to criminal troublemakers, but like an occupying power to people who did not want to put up with submission. It is precisely this reaction that also shows how closely resistance and racism were linked. Because the colonial power did not regard the population as equal political opponents, its resistance was dehumanized. Insurgents were considered wild, fanatical, ungrateful, or barbaric. Such attributions had a clear function: they made German violence easier to justify. Anyone who portrays resistance as an irrational or primitive outburst does not have to seriously deal with its causes. This gave rise to a pattern of interpretation that made colonial violence appear as a necessary restoration of order. Historically, it is therefore important to reverse the perspective and name resistance for what it often was: a legitimate reaction to foreign rule. In the German colonies, there was also no pure separation between war and everyday life. Even in phases without major uprisings, resistance remained present. It could consist of slow sabotage, the conscious understanding and undermining of colonial rules, or the use of colonial institutions for one's own purposes. Some people used mission schools to acquire new knowledge without accepting colonial rule. Others worked temporarily in the colonial system to gain resources that could then make them independent. Still others shifted loyalties depending on the situation. Such strategies show that resistance did not always have to be heroic and open to be effective. In a world marked by violence and inequality, even small forms of self-assertion could be significant. At the same time, one must not romanticize the difficulties. Resistance was dangerous. Those who openly opposed the colonial power risked their lives, their families, their possessions, and often the fate of entire communities. The German troops had modern weapons, military training, and a readiness for ruthless repression. That's why many uprisings ended in defeat or devastating losses. But even though the resistance was often defeated militarily, it remained historically effective. He destroyed the illusion that colonial rule was a matter of course. He repeatedly forced the Germans to expend resources, soldiers, and political energy. And he left behind memories that continued to have an effect on the societies concerned. A particularly important point is that resistance did not simply end with the end of individual uprisings. Even after heavy defeats, memories, experiences, and forms of rejection lived on. People adapted outwardly, but inwardly retained an awareness of the injustice they suffered. Families and communities remembered land loss, displacement, forced labor, and the dead. Such memories could retain political significance long after the end of German rule. Resistance is therefore not only a military event, but also part of collective memory and identity. For a long time, this resistance had a difficult place for German historiography. In older colonial representations, it was often distorted, devalued, or reduced to a security problem. Only later research has made it clearer that the uprisings and refusals are not marginal episodes, but core components of colonial history. They make it visible that the colonized were not silent objects, but acting people with their own interests, strategies, and political ideas. This shift in perspective is decisive because it detaches the history of the German colonies from the one-sided view of the rulers. This makes it clear that resistance to German colonial rule was not the exception, but the rule. Wherever Germany took land, levied taxes, claimed labor, or established political control, forms of resistance emerged. Some of them were local and quiet, others large and militarily organized. But all of them proved the same truth: German rule was not legitimate and not wanted. It had to be enforced against the interests of those affected. This is precisely why resistance is so important. It shows the limits of colonial power and reminds us that oppression has never remained without contradiction. The next chapter focuses on one of the most gruesome results of this confrontation: the genocide of the Herero and Nama. There it becomes particularly clear how the German colonial power reacted to resistance, not with a political solution, but with systematic extermination. Chapter 12: The Genocide of the Herero and Nama. The genocide of the Herero and Nama is one of the darkest chapters in German history. It took place long before National Socialism, and yet for many decades it was only marginally or not at all named for what it was: a targeted crime of extermination by the German colonial power. In German Southwest Africa, today's Namibia, at the beginning of the 20th century, it became radically clear where colonial rule could lead when land grabbing, racist ideology, military logic, and political will to rule were combined. The genocide was not the work of a single fanatical officer in a vacuum, but the result of a development that had been prepared for a long time. It grew out of a system of oppression in which the Herero and Nama were not seen as equal people with their own rights, but as an obstacle to German interests. Even before the Open War, the situation in German Southwest Africa had been deteriorating for years. German settlers, civil servants, and companies continued to expand their claims. Land was appropriated, livestock was lost, debt relations were exploited, and the political autonomy of indigenous communities was systematically undermined. For the Herero, this development was particularly threatening. Their society was strongly linked to livestock farming, and access to land and water was vital. But it is precisely these livelihoods that are coming under increasing pressure. German settlers claimed large areas, trade relations were often extremely unequal, and colonial structures shifted the balance of power further and further in favor of the occupiers. In addition, there was mistreatment, humiliation, and a growing feeling that German rule was not aimed at compromise, but at repression. Against this background, the uprising of the Herero in January 1904 was not a surprising outbreak of blind violence, but a reaction to years of oppression. Under the leadership of Samuel Maharero, parts of the Herero rose up against the German colonial power. They attacked farms, transport facilities, and German facilities. It was already clear that the resistance had a political character. It was not about senseless destruction, but about defending freedom, land, and future against a rule that was perceived as an existential threat. The German reaction was not long in coming. It became clear early on that Berlin and the colonial leadership were not interested in a political understanding. Instead of analyzing the causes or conducting serious negotiations, the focus was on military suppression. Initially, German troops under local commanders tried to fight the uprising. But soon General Lothar von Trotha was sent to Southwest Africa. With his arrival, the situation worsened dramatically. Von Trotha stood for a particularly brutal form of colonial thinking. He had already gained experience in other colonial contexts of violence, and was convinced that African resistance could only be broken by uncompromising military toughness. He considered negotiations to be weakness. In his thinking, the Herero were not a legitimate opponent to be dealt with politically, but an enemy that should be destroyed or removed from the room. It is precisely in this attitude that the connection between racism and military logic is shown. Anyone who sees an entire people not as a political community, but as a problem to be eliminated, prepares the ground for annihilation. The military turning point came in August 1904 at the Battle of Waterberg. The Herero, with many families, herds of cattle and possessions, had found themselves in a situation in which they represented not only fighting troops, but an entire threatened society. The German troops tried to encircle them and defeat them decisively. The battle itself was already cruel, but the real crime began afterwards. Instead of giving the defeated a way to survive or take prisoners, the Germans pushed the Herero into the Omahik Desert, a peripheral area of the Kalahari. There, water points were monitored or blocked, escape routes were cut off, and attempts to return by force were prevented. Von Trotha not only wanted to defeat the Herero militarily, but also to remove them from the country, even if that meant their death. On October 2, 1904, von Trotha issued his notorious extermination order. In this order, he declared that the Herero had to leave the country and that every Herero, whether armed or unarmed, whether man, woman, or child, would be shot if he was apprehended within the German borders. This order is one of the clearest documents of colonial extermination policy in German history. It shows unmistakably that it was no longer just a matter of military defeat, but of the destruction of a people as such. The Herero were not to be subjugated, but removed from the habitat and left to die. Thousands died in the desert of thirst, hunger, and exhaustion. Families fell apart, children died of thirst, the sick and the elderly were left behind. The desert became the scene of a mass extinction that was deliberately brought about. It is precisely here that it becomes apparent why historians today clearly speak of genocide. It was not about the excessive overreaction in a war, but about the targeted destruction of a group as a group. The German state used military force to physically destroy the Herero or remove them from colonial space. The language of the commanders at the time, the practice at the waterholes, and the treatment of women and children proved that the death of the Herero was not only accepted, but actively wanted. Later, the extermination order was formally weakened or withdrawn, not least because there was also criticism in the Reich. But by this time, the policy of extermination had already had a devastating effect. The violence did not end with mass deaths in the desert. Surviving Herero were captured, locked up in camps, and used for forced labor. These camps were places of extreme deprivation. Malnutrition, disease, abuse, and hard labor led to further mass deaths. The camp on Shark Island near Luderitz became particularly notorious, where prisoners lived under catastrophic conditions and many died. The survivors were not treated as people with rights, but as disenfranchised workers. Even after the extermination of large parts of the population, their suffering was still to be exploited economically. This also shows the logic of colonialism. Violence and exploitation went hand in hand. A little later, the Nama also got caught up in the maelstrom of this extermination policy. Under leaders such as Hendrik Witbooi and others, Nama groups rose up against the German colonial power. They too had recognized that German rule was not aimed at regulated coexistence, but at subordination and land grabbing. The Nama led a mobile resistance and used their local knowledge to evade German superiority for the time being. But the Germans also proceeded against them with extreme severity. Villages were destroyed, people were persecuted, captured, or killed. Many Nama also died in fighting, starvation, or in camps. This expanded the extermination policy. The genocide affected not only the Herero, but also the Nama, whose social and demographic destruction was also intentional or consciously accepted. The number of victims illustrates the extent of the crime. A large part of the Herero population was wiped out, as was a significant part of the Nama. Exact figures are difficult because of the sources, but the magnitude makes it clear that this was not an ordinary colonial war crime. Entire societies were destroyed, families wiped out, political orders shattered and cultural continuities violently interrupted. The genocide affected people not only as individuals, but as part of a collective existence. This is precisely where the particular gravity of the crime lies. The role of the German state and the German public in this context is particularly important. For a long time, the impression was created that the genocide was primarily the work of a single extreme general. Lothar von Trotha was undoubtedly centrally responsible, but that does not relieve the system. The colonial state had created the structures in which such annihilation became conceivable and feasible. Berlin sent troops, financed the war, and even pursued colonial goals that could not be achieved without violence. Even though there were debates and criticism of individual measures in the Reich, the fundamental colonial rule was hardly questioned. Many saw the war above all as a necessary restoration of German authority. This shows how deeply colonial ideologies were anchored in the empire. Racism played a fundamental role in this crime. Without the dehumanization of the Herero and Nama, such a policy would hardly have been conceivable. The victims were not seen as equal people with legitimate political goals, but as insurgents, savages, or tribes whose lives and deaths could be subordinated to the interests of colonial power. Especially in the language of the actors of the time, it becomes clear how much racist images determine perception. If entire population groups are considered inferior, the inhibition threshold for annihilation is lowered. The genocide was therefore not only a military crime, but a racist one. In addition, there was an economic motive. After the suppression of the resistance, the land of the Herero and Nama was made available to German settlers and companies on a large scale. The extermination and expulsion of the population facilitated the colonial reorganization of the area in favor of German interests. Land, livestock, and labor were integrated into the colonial economy. Here, too, it can be seen that genocide and economic exploitation were closely linked. The victims were not only killed, but also dispossessed, and even the survivors were forced into a system that benefited from their disenfranchisement. A particularly harrowing aspect of this chapter is how the dead and survivors are dealt with in a scientific context. Skulls and other mortal remains of victims were brought to Germany to be examined in racist research projects. Such practices show how extensive the dehumanization was. Even the dead were still exploited colonially and scientifically. The connection between colonialism, racial ideology, and science is particularly cruel here. People were not only destroyed, but then used as material for theories that were supposed to prove their alleged inferiority. For a long time, this crime was suppressed in Germany. While in Namibia the memory of the extermination lived on in families, communities, and political culture, it remained surprisingly marginal in German historical consciousness. The focus on other chapters of German history, especially on the crimes of National Socialism, meant that the colonial genocide received less attention for decades. This does not mean that he was completely unknown, but he was not firmly anchored in the public consciousness. It is only in recent decades that it has become more of a focus of research, the politics of remembrance and political debate. These debates also concern the question of continuities. Historians have repeatedly discussed whether and in what sense the genocide of the Herero and Nama can be understood as a precursor of later German history of violence. This is not about simple equations, but about structural connections, the role of racism, the dehumanization of victims, the connection between bureaucracy, the military, and the will to exterminate, the handling of camps, and the idea of removing an entire collective from a room. Such comparisons must be made carefully, but they make it clear that the history of colonial violence must not be viewed in isolation. It is part of a longer history of German practices of power and annihilation. For Namibia, the genocide has profound consequences to this day. Land issues, social inequalities, and collective memory are closely linked to colonial annihilation. Many descendants of the victims still live with the consequences of expropriation, expulsion, and social destruction. This is another reason why the question of recognition and reparation is so central. For a long time, Germany has had a hard time clearly naming the crime and drawing political consequences from it. The debate about how a former colonial state can assume responsibility has not yet been concluded. This is precisely why the genocide of the Herero and Nama is more than a historical detail of the colonial era. It forces us to tell German history differently. It shows that extreme forms of violence, racist extermination, and state-organized brutality did not only emerge within Europe in the 20th century, but were already practiced in a colonial context. It makes visible how closely colonialism was linked to the disregard for human life. And he reminds us that the victims and their descendants are not only objects of historical contemplation, but bearers of a living memory that demands recognition and justice. Looking at this chapter, it becomes clear that the genocide was not a slip, but the most radical consequence of a system that carried land grabbing, racism, and domination from the beginning. The Herero and Nama were not victims by chance. They became victims of a colonial power that saw their existence as an obstacle to German interests. This is precisely why genocide is a central chapter in German history, not only of colonial history, but of German history as a whole. The next chapter focuses on another serious violent crime of German colonial rule, the Maji Maji Uprising in German East Africa and the brutal reaction of the Germans. There too, it can be seen how the empire reacted to resistance, with a policy that was not only military, but also directed against the livelihoods of the population. Chapter 13, the Maji Maji Uprising and Other Excesses of Violence. The Maji Maji Uprising in German East Africa is one of the largest and at the same time long underestimated resistance movements against German colonial rule. Between 1905 and 1907, numerous communities rose up against a system that increasingly determined their lives, exploited their work, and threatened their livelihoods. The uprising was not a local incident, nor was it a spontaneous explosion of irrational anger, as colonial accounts have long described it. It was the result of a deep crisis that had been triggered by German power politics, economic coercion, and racist paternalism. The German reaction to this resistance was marked by extreme brutality. Not only armed fighters were fought, but the livelihoods of entire regions were deliberately destroyed. The Maji Maji War thus shows in a shocking way how the German colonial power reacted to widespread resistance, with hunger, devastation, and mass death. To understand the uprising, one must once again recall how German rule functioned in East Africa. In German East Africa, the German Reich tried to make a huge area economically usable and politically controllable. These included taxes, forced labor, infrastructure projects, military control, and the expansion of an export-oriented economy. Cotton cultivation became particularly important. The Germans wanted cotton to be produced in certain regions in order to make an economic profit. For many Africans, however, this meant that they could no longer use their labor according to their own needs. Time, energy, and land, which were actually used for food production or local life, were taken up by colonial requirements. The state expected obedience and production, regardless of whether this order worsened the lives of the local people. It was precisely these economic interventions that were at the heart of the crisis. From a colonial point of view, cotton was a sensible export good, but from the point of view of many of those affected, it was a symbol of foreign rule. People were forced to work in fields that did not serve them. Taxes made them additionally dependent on the colony's money circulation. Those who had to pay taxes needed income. Those who needed income were often forced to work for colonial projects or on plantations. This spiral of tax pressure, forced work, and production specifications changed the everyday life of entire regions. Family life, nutrition, social order, and regional autonomy came under pressure. What was described by the German side as economic development seemed to many people to be a destructive intervention in their lives. In addition, there was the everyday violence of the colonial administration. Beatings, humiliation, authoritarian behavior by officials and local enforcers, and the constant threat of military force were part of everyday colonial life. German rule was not only unintentional, but also noticeably humiliating. Many people experienced it as a combination of economic burden and human disrespect. It was precisely from this experience that a resistance arose that was not limited to a single group or region. This is one of the peculiarities of the Maji Maji Uprising. It affected numerous different communities and united them in a common rejection of German rule. The name of the uprising refers to a spiritual element that was very important for the mobilization. Maji means water. A religious political movement spread the idea that a special water could offer protection against German bullets or strengthen the fighters. Central to this was the figure of spiritual leader Kinjikatil Nguyen, who conveyed a message of unity and resistance. The spiritual dimension of the uprising was often used by German observers to devalue it as irrational, fanatical, or superstitious. But such a view falls short. In this context, spiritual mobilization was not an expression of irrationality, but a means of political communalization. It helped to unite different groups, create courage, and counter colonial superiority. In a situation in which the Germans were militarily far superior, symbolic and religious force played a decisive role in the formation of a common ability to act. The uprising began in 1905 in the south of German East Africa and spread rapidly. Numerous communities participated, attacking administrative stations, plantations, transport routes, and signs of colonial rule. In contrast to purely local conflicts, there was an unusually broad mobilization here. It was precisely this that alarmed the German leadership. For now it became clear that not only individual regions were dissatisfied, but that the rejection of German rule had intensified on a large scale. The Maji Maji Uprising was thus not only a military problem, but a political crisis of the entire colonial order. The German troops reacted with massive violence. As in other colonies, the colonial power relied on the Schutztruppe, i.e. on militarily organized units under German command. Their goal was not only the defeat of armed groups, but the complete restoration of colonial control. It quickly became apparent that the Germans did not just want to fight military battles, but were prepared to devastate entire regions. Villages were burned down, supplies destroyed, fields destroyed. The strategy was to break the resistance not only on the battlefield, but through starvation. Those who had no more food could not fight, flee, or survive. This policy was deliberate and systematic. It was directed against the foundations of life itself. This is precisely where the special cruelty of the German reaction lies. The colonial power did not limit itself to persecuting armed opponents. It destroyed food reserves, burned crops, and made entire landscapes uninhabitable. This meant that not only fighters, but also women, children, the elderly, and the sick became victims. The line between military combat and mass destruction of the civilian population was deliberately crossed. In many regions, a famine catastrophe occurred. People died not only from bullets, but from the consequences of German warfare, malnutrition, disease, flight, and collapse of supplies. The war was thus transformed into a large-scale destruction of social existence. The number of victims makes the extent of this violence clear. Historians assume that hundreds of thousands of people died as a result of the war, hunger, and devastation. The exact number is difficult to determine, but the magnitude is staggering. This makes the Maji Maji War one of the most serious violent crimes of German colonial rule. Even if it is not understood as genocide in the same way as the genocide of the Herero and Nama, German warfare was of a brutality that was deliberately directed against the livelihoods of entire populations. The mass extinction was not an unintended side effect, but the calculated consequence of a strategy that used hunger as a weapon. An important point here is that the Maji Maji Uprising made the weaknesses of German rule visible. If so many groups were ready to rise up against the Reich at the same time, then it showed how deep the discontent was. The colonial power wants to appear stable to the outside world, with administrative stations, railway construction, and economic projects. But beneath this surface lay a high degree of rejection. The uprising exposed the German order for what it was, a system that could only be maintained through coercion and fear. This is precisely why the colonial power reacted so mercilessly. She didn't just want to put down an uprising, she wanted to set an example. The German language about the war is also significant. In colonial reports, the opponents were often described as uncontrolled masses, fanatical, or backward. The spiritual dimension of the Maji was used as evidence of primitiveness, not as an indication that people were seeking common forms of self-empowerment under extreme pressure. Such interpretations served to make German violence appear as a necessary restoration of order. Anyone who depoliticizes the resistance does not have to seriously deal with its causes. Therefore, it is important not to trivialize the Maji Maji Uprising as an uprising or tribal war, but to understand it as a broad anti-colonial movement. The consequences of the war extended far beyond the immediate number of victims. Entire regions were devastated, social structures destroyed, and economic foundations destroyed. Families lost loved ones, villages were depopulated, local authorities weakened or eliminated. The experience of hunger, flight, and death had a profound impact on the societies affected. Even though German rule put down the uprising militarily, the memory of this violence remained alive in the communities. For many people, the war was not just a defeat, but a traumatic sign of how far the colonial power was willing to go. On the German side, the uprising partly led to a rethink in the administration, but not out of a humanitarian conscience, but out of the interest of power. Some leaders recognized that excessive economic pressure and gross mistreatment created political explosives. For this reason, attempts were subsequently made to modify certain forms of colonial administration. Forced work and economic control did not disappear at all, but they were organized differently in some cases. However, these changes must not be misunderstood as genuine humanization. The goal remained the stable domination and economic use of the colony. If methods have been adapted, it is mainly to make rule more efficient in the long run. The Maji Maji War is also historically important because it shows that German colonial power was not limited to a single area or a single group of perpetrators. After the genocide in Southwest Africa, one could perhaps have argued that it was an extreme special case. But the events in East Africa show that there too, under different conditions and in different forms, massive violence was used against entire populations. The German colonial rule was therefore not only brutal in some places, but structurally ready to respond to resistance with comprehensive destruction. This connects Southwest Africa and East Africa despite all the differences. In addition, the Maji Maji Uprising reveals the close connection between the economy and violence. The conflict arose not least from colonial economic policy, cotton cultivation, tax pressure, work obligations. And the reaction of the Germans was to completely attack the economic foundations of the population. Fields, supplies, and villages became the target of warfare. This makes it clear that colonial economics did not exist peacefully alongside military rule, but was itself a relationship of violence. When people are forced to produce for other people's interests, and when they are starved to death when they resist, then the economy is not only the background, but part of the crime. The uprising also shows the importance of unity across local borders. Many communities in East Africa had different languages, political structures, and regional interests. The fact that they were nevertheless able to unite in a broad resistance was remarkable. It was precisely the shared experience of colonial oppression that created a connection that went beyond traditional differences. Even if this alliance was not militarily successful, it had great political significance. It proves that anti-colonial consciousness did not only emerge in the 20th century in the independence movements of the post-war period, but already in the colonial period itself. In the German culture of remembrance, the Maji Maji War was long overshadowed by other chapters. The genocide of the Herero and Nama has been increasingly discussed, at least in recent years, while the Maji Maji Uprising has often remained less well known. This is also due to the fact that the focus here is not on a single, clearly formulated extermination order, but on a form of warfare whose murderous character results from strategy and consequences. But this is precisely why a precise historical classification is important. Even without a single document, as in Southwest Africa, it is obvious that German policy in East Africa caused hundreds of thousands of deaths and deliberately used hunger as a means of war. The Maji Maji War was not a tragic industrial accident, but a colonial crime of violence. If one looks at this chapter in the context of the entire German colonial history, then it becomes clear that the Maji Maji Uprising contains a central lesson. German rule was not based on consent, but on coercion. Where this coercion met with widespread rejection, the colonial power responded with extreme severity. The violence was not only directed against armed opponents, but against entire worlds. This is precisely the colonial logic that became so brutally visible in East Africa. The war was not only waged against people, but against their ability to live. Thus, the Maji Maji Uprising stands for two things at the same time: for the courage and determination of many people to rise up against an overpowering foreign rule, and for the unscrupulous brutality with which the German Reich defended its colonial interests. He reminds us that resistance to colonialism was always associated with high risks, but nevertheless arose again and again. And he shows how much the history of the German colonies is a history of violence against those who did not want to submit. The next chapter is about the end of the German colonies in the First World War. It shows how the German colonial empire finally collapsed, and why its formal end did not mean that its consequences simply disappeared. Chapter 14: The End of the German Colonies in World War I. When the First World War began in the summer of 1914, it was not only Europe that caught fire. The overseas possessions of the colonial powers also became part of the global conflict. This made clear what the German Empire had always strived for with its colonial empire: a global political presence. But it was precisely this global interdependence that led to the German colonies in Africa, the Pacific and China being drawn very quickly into military conflicts. The war meant the end for the German colonial empire. Within a few years, all German possessions were lost. But this end was more than a mere change of power on maps. It was the failure of a colonial project that had begun with great ambitions, but was neither permanently stable nor fully successful. At the same time, the end of German colonial rule did not mean the end of colonial oppression for the people affected. In many cases, only the European power that now ruled over them changed. In order to understand the significance of this turning point, one must first understand the situation in which the German colonial empire found itself before the war. Although Germany had entered relatively late compared to older colonial powers, by 1914 the Reich had built up a considerable network of overseas possessions. In Africa, it controlled German Southwest Africa, German East Africa, Cameroon, and Togo. In the Pacific, these included German New Guinea, Samoa, the Marshall Islands, the Caroline Islands, the Mariana Islands, and Nauru. In China, the empire had the least territory of Kiautschou with the port of Tsingtao. These areas differed greatly in size, economic importance, and form of administration. What they had in common, however, was that they were an expression of Germany's claims to world power. Colonies meant prestige, military reach, and the claim to keep up with international competition. But even before 1914, the German colonial empire was by no means as stable as it often appeared in official accounts. There had been serious uprisings in several colonies, including the war against the Herero and Nama in German Southwest Africa and the Maji Maji Uprising in German East Africa. These conflicts had shown that German rule was deeply contested and could only be maintained at considerable military and financial expense. In addition, the economic balance of many colonies was ambivalent. Although individual companies and settlers benefited, the costs for administration, infrastructure, and the military were high. Precisely for this reason, the colonial empire was in a certain way both a symbol of power and an expression of insecurity. It was a project that had to be constantly defended, legitimized, and stabilized against resistance. With the outbreak of the First World War, the situation changed fundamentally. Germany now not only faced powerful opponents in Europe, but also had to reckon with the fact that its overseas possessions would also be attacked. For the Entente powers, i.e. above all Great Britain, France, Japan, and later other allies, the German colonies were militarily and strategically interesting targets. They offered bases, radio stations, ports, and symbolic booty. At the same time, many of these areas were only weakly defended. The German colonial empire was hardly equipped for a global war. Although it had protective troops and local garrisons, it had no realistic possibility of holding the colonies against coordinated attacks by major powers in the long term. The war thus exposed a structural weakness. Germany's colonial empire was geographically widely dispersed, militarily isolated and dependent on the supply lines of the motherland. German rule in Togo collapsed particularly quickly. Togo was a relatively small colony and was important to the Allies mainly because of its radio station. Shortly after the start of the war, British and French troops marched in. The German forces were militarily inferior, and after a short time the colony capitulated. Togo thus became one of the first German overseas territories to be lost. This rapid collapse also had a symbolic effect. It showed how limited Germany's ability was to defend its colonies in an emergency. The image of an orderly model colony was of little help when the military situation was hopeless. In Cameroon, too, German rule quickly came under pressure. British, French, and Belgian forces attacked from different sides. The terrain, the size of the area, and the logistical difficulties made the campaign more complex than in Togo, but in the end Germany was unable to maintain its position here either. The resistance of the German troops dragged on for a long time, but eventually they had to retreat or capitulate. Cameroon thus became another example of the fact that the German colonial empire did not have a viable defense structure in a global war. The colonies were an expression of imperial ambition, but militarily they remained vulnerable. In German Southwest Africa, the situation was somewhat different. There, the German settler presence was stronger, and the colony bordered southern Africa, which was dominated by Great Britain. South African troops attacked on behalf of the British Empire. The German units resisted, but were ultimately unable to hold the colony. In 1915, the German forces capitulated. It is particularly revealing here that the very colony that was considered particularly important in German thinking, and in which settlement interests played a major role, was nevertheless relatively clearly lost. This, too, made it clear that colonial rule ultimately depended on larger geopolitical power relations. As brutal as the German order had been on the ground, its ability to assert itself against a superior imperial military power was limited. A special case was German East Africa. There, the German troops under Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck succeeded in waging the war much longer than in the other colonies. Lettow-Vorbeck relied on mobile warfare, evasion, smaller battles, and the use of local conditions. His troops consisted not only of German officers, but also to a considerable extent of African soldiers, the askari, as well as porters, without whom the campaign would not have been possible. In later German memory, this war was often glorified. Lettow-Vorbeck was considered by some to be a kind of undefeated colonial hero because his troops held their ground for a long time and only stopped fighting in Europe after the armistice. But this narrative is problematic and incomplete. Because the war in German East Africa was a catastrophe for the civilian population. Mobile warfare also meant constant requisitioning, forced labor, porter services, hunger, and devastation. Hundreds of thousands of people suffered from the consequences of the war. African porters in particular, who had to transport loads over enormous distances, paid a high price. Many died of exhaustion, illness, or lack of supply. The myth of the strategically skillful and honorable colonial war largely ignores these human costs. In fact, the campaign in East Africa was another example of how colonial warfare was based on the exploitation and disenfranchisement of African bodies. The German resistance was therefore not simply militarily admirable, but part of a history of violence that again affected the local population in particular. The German possessions were also lost outside Africa. In the Pacific, Allied powers occupied the German island territories relatively quickly. New Zealand took German Samoa, Australian troops occupied German New Guinea, and Japan conquered the German Pacific Islands north of the equator. These occupations often took place without long military conflicts, which once again shows how limited German access to its widely scattered possessions actually was. Especially in the Pacific, the colonial empire was heavily dependent on maritime connection and symbolic presence. As soon as this connection was cut off during the war, the rule quickly collapsed. A particularly important case was Kiautschou in China. The leased area with the city of Tsingtao had been important for the German Reich not only economically, but also strategically and symbolically. It was considered a showcase of German order and a naval base in East Asia. When Japan entered the war on the side of the Entente in 1914, it attacked Kiautschou together with British forces. After siege and fierce fighting, Tsingtao fell in November 1914. As a result, the German Reich lost its most important base in China. This was not only a military setback, but also a serious blow to the image of German international standing. Kiautschou in particular had liked to present the empire as proof of its global power. Now it became clear how quickly such symbolic empire projects could break up. With the defeats in the colonies, the German colonial empire had effectively collapsed even before the war in Europe had been decided. The peace treaty after 1918 finally sealed this loss. In the Treaty of Versailles, Germany had to renounce all colonies. These possessions were not simply independent, but transferred to other powers as mandate territories of the League of Nations. Great Britain, France, Belgium, Japan, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa took over the former German colonies or parts of them. Formally, this was often presented as fiduciary administration in the interest of the population. In reality, it remained colonial rule. The change consisted mainly in the fact that other powers now took the place of Germany. This is precisely an important point. The end of the German colonial empire was not automatically a moment of liberation for the colonized societies. Many people had suffered under German rule, resisted and hoped for an end to foreign rule. But what followed was usually not self-determination, but integration into new colonial structures. In Togo and Cameroon, for example, Great Britain and France divided the territories among themselves. German Southwest Africa was placed under South African control. German East Africa became for the most part a British mandate, while Rwanda and Burundi went to Belgium. The Pacific Islands were distributed between Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. This continued the colonial principle, only under different flags. For Germany itself, the loss of the colonies had profound political and cultural consequences. In the Weimar Republic, a colonial idea of revision quickly emerged. Many politicians, associations and publicists regarded the loss of the colonies as an unjust humiliation. Colonial lobby groups were formed that demanded the return of the colonies and claimed that Germany had ruled there particularly efficiently or even humanely. This politics of remembrance was highly distorted. It largely ignored the history of violence in the colonies and replaced it with a narrative of undeservedly lost national property. It is precisely this colonial nostalgia that shows that the end of the colonial empire did not mean that colonial thinking disappeared in Germany. On the contrary, so-called colonial revisionism had a considerable influence on parts of the political culture of the interwar period. Colonies were invoked as a symbol of former greatness, and the idea that Germany had a right to overseas possessions remained alive in many circles. There were also colonial demands under the National Socialists at times, even if these later took a back seat to the expansionist goals in Europe. This means that the formal end of the colonial empire did not close the colonial chapter in the thinking of many Germans. The longing for global power, the glorification of colonial rule, and the suppression of colonial crimes continued to have an effect. Another important aspect concerns the people in the former colonies, who had to deal with new political realities during the war and after the change of power. Some had hoped for a weakening of the Germans, others were integrated into colonial military structures, and still others tried to use local room for maneuver in the period of upheaval. The change of power often meant new administration, new languages of rule, and sometimes different economic priorities. But the basic colonial structure was mostly preserved. For many, the end of German rule was therefore ambivalent. It ended a particularly burdensome order, but did not yet open up real political freedom. In retrospect, the First World War marked a double turning point. On the one hand, it ended the German colonial empire as a political entity. Germany lost all formal possessions and disappeared from the circle of active colonial powers for the time being. On the other hand, It was precisely this collapse that made visible how fragile the empire had been. The colonies were an expression of entitlement and violence, but not of stable legitimacy. They quickly collapsed as soon as larger military forces encountered them and the connection to the motherland was severed. This speaks against any retrospective glorification. The German colonial empire was not a permanently consolidated world empire, but a comparatively young, contested, and ultimately vulnerable project. But although the Reich lost its colonies in 1918, their consequences did not disappear. The memory of violence, land grabbing, and coercion remained in the societies concerned. The economic and social structures that the Germans had helped to build or destroy continued to have an effect. In Germany, too, colonial images, concepts, and fantasies of power remained present. Therefore, the end of the German colonies is not simply the end of history, but rather a transition. Direct rule ended, but its aftermath remained, in the former colonies as well as in the German self-image. Precisely for this reason, this chapter leads directly to the last big question of this history. How is the German colonial era remembered today? What responsibility arises from it? And what consequences reach into our present? This is the subject of the next chapter, which focuses on remembrance, reappraisal, and the aftermath of German colonialism that can still be felt today. Chapter 15: Remembrance, Responsibility, and Consequences to the Present Day. With the loss of the German colonies after the First World War, the formal rule of the empire in Africa, the Pacific, and China came to an end. But history doesn't end the moment a contract is signed or a flag is lowered. The consequences of colonialism continue to have an impact, in the former colonies, in the societies affected, but also in Germany itself. Land distribution, economic inequality, cultural devaluation, racist images, and political displacement did not simply disappear with the end of direct rule. This is precisely why German colonial history is still a topical topic today. It concerns not only the past, but also the question of how memory works, how responsibility is assumed, and what traces colonial thinking has left behind in the present. For a long time, German colonial history played only a subordinate role in the public consciousness of the Federal Republic. When talking about Germany's past, the focus was usually on other eras: the German Empire as a precursor to the First World War, National Socialism, the Holocaust, the division of Germany, and reunification. These issues are undoubtedly central, but it was precisely their dominance that contributed to the colonial era receding into the background. Many people had the impression that colonialism was primarily an issue for Great Britain, France, Spain, or Portugal. In this narrative, Germany appeared more as a late and comparatively insignificant colonial power. The fact that this view was historically wrong, or at least greatly abbreviated, only gradually became clearer. One reason for this displacement was also that Germany lost its colonies as early as 1918. Unlike other countries, the Federal Republic of Germany was no longer an active colonial power later. Over decades, this gave rise to the comfortable idea that the present had little to do with German colonial history. But this distance is deceptive, because the violence that was exercised in the colonies did not simply disappear from the world. The consequences of land grabbing, economic restructuring, and social destruction continued to have an impact in the affected regions. At the same time, many cultural and intellectual traces of the colonial era have been preserved in Germany, often without being perceived as such. This is particularly evident in the question of memory. In many former colonies, especially in Namibia and Tanzania, the history of German rule has never really disappeared. There it was and is carried forward in families, communities, and political debates. Descendants of the victims of colonial violence remember expulsion, forced labor, expropriated land, and the dead. In Namibia, the genocide of the Herero and Nama is not a distant special topic, but part of a living historical memory. For many people there, the question of recognition and justice is not abstract, but directly linked to their social and political present. In Germany, on the other hand, this memory was poorly received for a long time. It is precisely this difference that shows how unequally history can be remembered, depending on whether one is on the side of the victims or the former perpetrator society. Only in recent decades has this gradually changed. Historians, activists, initiatives from civil society and voices from the former colonies have contributed to raising public awareness of German colonial history. It is not just about rediscovering a neglected topic, but about shifting perspective. For a long time, colonial history was told primarily from the perspective of German actors, from the perspective of governors, officers, civil servants, missionaries, and entrepreneurs. Today, there is a greater question of how the people affected experienced the rule, what consequences they still feel today, and how colonial structures reach into the present. This change is fundamental because it transforms memory from a mere collection of historical facts to a matter of justice. A particularly central area of this debate is how to deal with the genocide of the Herero and Nama. For many decades, the crime in Germany was named only hesitantly or insufficiently. It was only later that the clear recognition that it was genocide prevailed. This recognition was important, but it was only a first step. Because remembrance alone is not enough if it has no consequences. The naming of the crime raises further questions. What responsibility does this give rise to for the German state? What form of apology is appropriate? Is symbolic recognition enough, or do material and political forms of reparation also have to be discussed? Such questions are difficult, but unavoidable. Anyone who acknowledges a crime must also deal with the consequences of this recognition. This is not only about diplomacy between states, but also about the descendants of the victims. In Namibia in particular, there has been repeated criticism that negotiations between governments do not automatically mean that the affected communities themselves are sufficiently heard. This shows a fundamental problem of post-colonial memory politics. Who speaks for whom? Who is allowed to decide on compensation, commemoration, and reconciliation? And is it enough for former colonial powers to negotiate with today's governments without fully involving the historical bearers of memory? These questions make it clear that responsibility is not only a legal or financial matter, but also a question of political participation and respect. Closely related to this is the debate about restitution, i.e., the return of stolen cultural assets and human remains. For a long time, German museums, universities, and collections contained numerous objects that had come to Germany under colonial conditions. These include works of art, everyday objects, ritual objects, and also human bones that were collected for racist research purposes. The handling of human remains is particularly shocking, because it shows how deep the dehumanization of the colonial era reached. People were not only disenfranchised, expelled, or murdered, but even their bodies were scientifically exploited. The return of such remains is therefore not only a question of museum policy, but an act of dignity. Cultural assets are also about more than property in the legal sense. Many of these objects have religious, cultural, or historical significance for the societies of origin. Their presence in European museums is often the result of violence, unequal power relations, or colonial pressure. The demand for restitution therefore raises the fundamental question of who owns history and who is allowed to dispose of cultural heritage. In Germany, this debate has gained in importance in recent years. Museums are under increasing pressure to critically examine the origin of their holdings and to deal more transparently with the colonial past of their collections. This development is important because it shows that colonial history does not only exist in archives and books, but is still present in institutions and objects today. Another area in which colonial traces become visible is public space. In many German cities, there were and are streets, squares, or monuments that commemorate colonial actors. Names of colonial officials, officers, or so-called explorers have long been treated as a natural part of the city's culture of remembrance. Only recently has there been more questioning as to why people who were involved in oppression, land grabbing, or violence are being honored. Debates about street renaming or explanatory boards are therefore not trivialities, but an expression of a deeper conflict. What story should be visible in public space, and from whose perspective is it told? Opponents of such changes often claim that they want to erase history. But in fact, it is usually about the opposite, a more accurate and honest form of remembrance. A street name that honors colonial perpetrators does not tell a neutral story. He is already setting a score. When such names are changed or contextualized, history does not disappear, but is problematized for the first time. This is precisely the meaning of a critical culture of remembrance. It is not intended to preserve comfortable traditions, but to sharpen historical awareness. This does not erase the colonial past, but makes it visible, including its violence. In addition, the question of colonial continuities in thinking arises. Colonialism was not only a political system, but also a system of images, concepts, and hierarchies. Many racist stereotypes, ideas of cultural superiority, or exoticizing views of African and other non-European societies have roots in the colonial era. This does not mean that every form of racism today comes directly and unchanged from the German Empire. But it does mean that colonial ways of thinking have shaped German society and can continue to have an effect in certain patterns. Anyone who talks about structural racism today cannot avoid colonial history. It is part of the historical deep layer from which modern inequalities have emerged. These continuities are often evident in language. Some terms, images, or idioms that were long considered harmless have their origins in colonial worldviews. They convey ideas of otherness, inferiority, or exoticism without always being aware of this. This is precisely why dealing with language is so important. It's not just about banning individual words or marking them morally, but about the insight that language shapes perception. Those who repeat colonial terms uncritically often also adopt part of the hierarchy that is inherent in them. A reflected language is therefore part of a reflected memory. A lot has also changed in the education sector, but by no means enough. German colonial history is often still only marginally mentioned in schools, although it is a key topic for understanding racism, imperialism, and global inequality. If colonialism is treated only as a secondary aspect of European power politics, a central part of history is missing. It is not just about additional facts, but about a different perspective on the German past. Anyone who learns that Germany not only produced victims and perpetrators within Europe, but also exercised colonial rule over other continents, gets a more comprehensive picture of history. This is precisely a prerequisite for responsible historical thinking. In this context, responsibility means more than feelings of guilt. It is not about today's generations being held personally liable for colonial crimes. It is about acknowledging that historical violence has consequences that do not simply disappear with the death of the perpetrators at the time. Anyone who lives in a society whose institutions, museums, cities, images, and bodies of knowledge have been shaped by colonial history bears responsibility for how this heritage is dealt with. Responsibility therefore means listening, acknowledging, correcting, giving back, renaming, researching, and above all, taking the perspectives of those affected seriously. In doing so, remembrance must be defended again and again against trivialization. There are still attempts to portray the German colonial period as a short, incidental, or, compared to other colonial empires, less problematic episode. Such narratives fail to recognize the extent of the violence and the depth of the consequences. It is true that Germany had a colonial empire for only a relatively short time. But historical significance is not measured in decades alone. Even a few decades can be enough to kill tens of thousands of people, destroy societies, permanently change land conditions, and deeply entrench racist ways of thinking. It is precisely the brevity of the German colonial period that makes the intensity of their violence even more striking. At the same time, a serious debate also includes viewing the former colonies not only as sites of German crimes, but as societies with their own history, their own resistance, and their own present. Colonial memory must not remain paternalistic. It is not enough to talk about victims without perceiving the descendants as acting political subjects. That is why it is so important to include voices from Namibia, Tanzania, Cameroon, Togo, the Pacific, and other affected regions in the debate. Remembrance is not something that Germany manages alone. It is a transnational process in which different historical experiences meet. Ultimately, all this leads to a simple but far-reaching realization. the history of the German colonies is not over. It lives on, in archives and museums, in street names and school textbooks, in political debates and in the social consequences of colonial violence. It lives on in the question of who owns land, whose history is visible and whose suffering is acknowledged. It lives on in the relations between Germany and the countries that were once under German rule. And it lives on in the way Germany sees itself, as a country that takes its past seriously or not seriously enough. This closes the arc of this script. The German colonies were not a marginal issue and not an exotic appendix of national history. They were a part of that history in which striving for power, economic interests, racism, violence, and resistance are combined in a particularly clear way. Anyone who deals with them does not only look at distant places and past decades. He also looks at the present, at the question of how societies deal with historical injustice, how memory is shaped, and whether responsibility can be more than a word. Precisely for this reason, the history of the German colonies does not end with the loss of the colonies in the First World War. Nor does it end with a political statement, a commemorative event, or a return from a museum. It remains a task of remembering, learning, correcting, and listening. And perhaps this is precisely the most important insight at the end of this journey. Past domination does not simply pass. It leaves its mark, and the question is whether we are ready to really see it.